Good evening, all. When I watch the start of the videos back on our live streams, there's always a bit of delay at the start, and I'm guessing it's my computer deceiving me with a little spinning wheel, and I don't think we're quite live yet. So, oh well. It's having an old computer that if you remember last week, it crashed on me. So let's hope it doesn't do it tonight. As you are all fully aware in chat, I am the old geek. And I am joined tonight by the cracker of the whip, the layer down of the law, the epitome of lawful evil. It's our friend Saxius.
Hello, everyone. I'm back. You can't keep me away.
There might be a few others joining us. I know Elfbait's going to be busy tonight, so we don't have his balanced and intelligent input here, unfortunately, because he's often a voice of reason and a voice of sense amongst our nonsensical ramblings. But there might be others joining. So, and if anyone does want to join, the link is in the Discord channel. And the Discord channel isn't in the description to the video because I couldn't be bothered to paste it earlier. I was a bit late even creating the stream. But if you look at one of my videos, there was a Discord link in there. So if you want to come and join in, then you're more than welcome to do so. Because we are an inclusive stream and we allow everybody, including weirdos like us, because we are weirdos. Right. So, this is a topic that Saxius posted in our little discussions we have in the Discord, and it has stirred up a bit of discussion in our sort of our Discord channel already. So I don't know how much is left to say here tonight, but let's hopefully there is, and it is to do with what makes a character and what defines a class, and what's the difference between a character and a class, and how do we look at it, and how do we expect people to play it out, and how do we like it ourselves, and all that sort of stuff. It was Saxius's idea, so I think Saxius should start us off. Once I've said hello to all the people that I see in chat, I have seen General Nut, who is our first channel member. Cheers, General Nut. Every penny I'm making from this channel is going to get invested back into the channel and into physical gaming stuff that I intend to talk about at some point on the channel. So that's, unless of course it blows up and I somehow get 20,000 subscribers and I can buy a new car, but that is highly unlikely. So thank you, General Nut. You're a star. Hello to William Guillon. I think it looks French. Name looks French. Hello to Halakar. Hello to AB Mark II. And there's Mage's Musings. I see, and Dean Pala and Grumpy Old Slan. And there's Saxius commenting. You're multitasking here, aren't you, Saxius? And here's Michael Stronghold. So welcome, everybody. So, Saxius, why did you suggest this topic? I'll answer that question to start with.
Well, so one thing when you were asking for what were good topics, and I often found myself getting into very good discussions, very constructive discussions when it boils down to how people can take what a class is and make it unique. And often I find that people will bounce back and forward about it. What is a class? What does the class bring mechanically? What's a character? How can you breathe life into the person who has a class? How does the class influence the character? How can the character be an instrument for the class as well? And all of these different combinations. It's one of those discussions where I have a lot of preconceived notions when someone says, I want to play a fighter. I want to come in and I want to be a wizard. I want to play a bard. I want to have these things. Because of how I know they work mechanically, I immediately go, right, so you're going to have these mechanics, but is that then going to have an impact to how your character turns out to be? Because that's where I get quite interested to see how different players, how different DMs, and how anyone who plays this hobby, effectively how they interpret the same black and white text that is crunch, and brings flavoring into how they bring the spice into, well, the fun of why we play it. And there can be so many different interpretations to what can make a class unique and what a character can bring to a class. So that's why I brought it out. It's one of those that we often have where different interpretations, different viewpoints, different expectations usually leads to a lot of people comparing notes. And I think that's probably one of the healthiest thing, because that's what we love doing here. We love talking, within the parameters that I put.
And when you're not here, we just go rambling on and talk nonsense.
It's terrible. I can't deal with it. I can't watch back on it. So
but I can already tell from the response we've had in the Discord channel, mainly between Omen Owl and Elfbait, that there are differing opinions on this topic. I will say now that I am very much in the camp that a class should either reflect a profession or a culture of the character. For example, I like, if I'm playing a fighter in a traditional D&D world, that character is not going to have a day job of being a librarian or an alchemist. He's much more likely to be a soldier, a guardsman, or a blacksmith, or a hunter, or a farmer, something physical, because it is a physical class. His personality can be anything, but in terms of what he does on a day-to-day basis that gives him his general sort of day-to-day existence in the world, or even what he did before he became an adventurer, or what he does in between adventures, it will be something physical. Unless he has advanced to high levels and he's become a military tactician or a politician or something like that, or even retired. But I like to have that feeling, that link between class and profession. And I think it's my first edition sort of roots, whereby if you had a class, it was assumed that you had been through some form of training to get to that first level spot. It was necessary if you were a magic user, and it was assumed you were going to have training to go up between the levels. It wasn't enough just to experience adventuring. You had to learn new skills. You had to be taught by somebody who is better than you at that style of adventuring. I have a really hard time with them, especially multi-classing in the modern game, where characters just wake up and are better, or wake up and they can choose another class. I don't want any of that. I like to link the class to the profession and have the class feel like a profession. Or, in the example of some classes, link it to a culture, like a druid or a barbarian. These are much more cultural, in my opinion.
No,
but none of these define personality, though. Personality is different, but your personality, you're more likely to be a sort of in-your-face gung-ho type if you are a warrior than you are to be like a bookish nerd, because it's just the way we create our characters.
Well, I was going to ask warrior poets.
Warrior poets. Well, there you go. Then
they're red.
Then when you create the character, you better give that character decent intelligence and maybe a bit of charisma.
Well, there you go. So you can't. So from what the framework that you set out, let's use the warrior as a good example. The fighters. These are our bread and butter, our potatoes and mash, our everything that we need. In that, I cannot see any group of adventuring parties that goes out adventuring without having some form of warrior, someone who is going to be the heavy lifter, who comes in there slapped on with meats, slapped on with strength, or at the very least constitution, because you can have average strength. But if you've got a strong constitution, if you've got stamina for days, that it will make up everything in its own rights, especially when you start taking that venturing into consideration. But then you start looking at it, it's like, well, this is like a cardboard box. This is the stock and standard. Here's what it is, exactly what you would expect from it. But then turn it around and say warrior poets, give them some intelligence, make them literate. If we're using AD&D, your warriors not going to be literate. You're going to assume you haven't been taught that, or even better yet, turn around and say you're a lower noble. Well, at that stage, you definitely would be a literate person. You would have been tutored. You're going to be knowing your letters, your alphabet, your numbers, your mathematicians, your accountant. Definitely, you're some accountants.
But if you want to make that sort of character and you're using the 4d6 rearrange method, don't be putting that 6 or 7 in intelligence if that's the type of character you want to play.
No, but like this is where you have to look at, what's the class, what's the mechanics that comes with it. Well, this typical thing is that you're going to be looking at some form of physical attribute being a prime stat. That's a necessary thing, or at the very least, you need them to be average, so that is not going to become a hindrance. And if you then need to turn that around and say, like, all right, well, I'm playing a nobleman, I am going to put a higher point, let's say a 14, into my charisma because I am tutored at the very beginning to be a aristocrat. I am noble. I have a higher standing. I carry myself with a different fashion than anyone else. You don't even have to be a paladin for that, in that sense, but you're already seeing how you can change what how the class, not necessarily how the function is, because you're not going to be changing the numbers, but the class will have a very different spin on it when you are willing to take a plunge and say, right, I'll take the prime ones, be a little bit, we'll take a bit of a hit in the lower levels because I won't have a bonus to hit, or we're not going to be carrying so much. But in a way, that's going to lead out to some different and actually, in my opinion, exciting kind of adventuring. Because if you don't have a mule, an actual animal mule with you to carry all your hoard with you, you've got to be very selective. And suddenly the wizard with their praise or the thief with their praising skills, being able to go through what you found, find the items of high value so you can bring them back, invest that, come back, get the rest, and so forth and so on. But this is how you then start, at least how I start looking at what will bring, how a character can change a class in a way. Because now you're looking at what you've got as a concept, the personality, and how you can then have that be influenced into the mechanics of said thing. Again, using the idea of the nobleman, just changing the stats a little bit around. You're still going to be a fighter. You're still going to be able to do the physical things that are required of you, being up in the front. You're still going to have a D10. You're going to have much more hit points than, well, practically everyone else. The person that's going to beat you right is going to be the priest or the cleric, because they're going to be the second highest one, and they will then be giving you some love tabs to keep you up. And then this is how I see you can change it around, how you can sort of like breathe more character into the class, and how the class will, in a symbiotic way, you'll work with one another. Because a fighter who is then to a nobleman, it's something you can practically see as an expectation, and it would work, especially once you start changing it around with let's say different intelligence.
I am going to say the warrior poet. We do have various versions of the bard that could fulfill that role. I know second edition had the Skald kit, which could be used, which was in essence the Norse warrior poet that was based that the Skald, and that was a variant of bard. So you can have. It's not all of these ideas of characters. They're not mutually exclusive.
No,
it's like a big Venn diagram which can meet in the middle. For example, a soldier type, just a simple soldier, could be a cleric, could be a paladin, could be a ranger, could be a fighter. I would say that the magic user, traditional wizard, would be outside of that Venn diagram, because that is not a traditional soldier, because you expect the soldier has the expectations.
You can still have a war mage. there will
warmage,
still
but
be.
it's still not a foot soldier, though, is it? It's still
You're not looking at someone as a foot soldier, but then again, if you take let's look at this. You're going to have your typical sort of soldiers, but if you have, for example, a war mage, that would be considered to be a specialist, but they would still be, at least. I'm speaking specifically of second edition because I know they had war mages in there. But I think for our discussion, if we keep it to AD&D 1E, that era, it will be easier mechanics-wise. But the idea of a wizard trained to at least be able to adapt within a war situation, the simple thing, if this is something you're making up, you will be cutting back on how much they're going to be learning in terms of their spells, because they don't have the same time. They will at least be able to wield some weapons. You can argue back and forth in regards to the armor, although I would say at the very least they're not going to be having more than padded armor, because that will not be restricting their actual movements. And then that will be about it. But you can, well, that's getting more into like the actual making up house rules now.
I'm just going to say, I am. It's obvious that chat are paying no attention whatsoever to what we're saying. They are making up poetry, little limericks. I just do. Where are we? I'm just going to scroll up. Hello to everyone else who's joined chat in the last few minutes who I haven't yet said hello to. We've got Dew and Lumin. We've got Adam Pender. We've got Ian McDonald. And we've probably got others. Omen Owls here. Grumpy Old Slan. I don't know if I've said hello to you yet or not. To be honest, it's my brain isn't particularly great. Right, where was it? Where was it there? Yes. I can't find the bit. There once was a geek from Britain whom the RPG bug had bitten. He started a stream, built up a team, and attempts to make YouTube smitten. Thank you, Mage's Musings. Yes, it scans, doesn't it? And it rhymes, and it does what a limerick should do, and it's suitably silly. Yeah,
that is a good one. Well done, Mage.
Well done, Mage's Musing. Yes, check out his channel.
Oh, absolutely. Now,
absolutely.
But
right, where were we?
We come back to the idea again. We're sticking with warriors. We're sticking with fighters. You have the expectation that mechanically they have to be up in the front. Everyone in the entire team will be turning around going like, fighter, brilliant, sword and board, pole arm, long swords. What do we expect from you? And it's like, well, think of the few times I've gotten to play, and if I've ever sort of gone like, what if I made a fighter with a longbow? Most teams will turn around and go like, what? A fighter? Purely on longbow, not in the front, not defending our very front line. What is this? What is this madness?
Well, in the AD&D game I've been running recently, one of the there's a fighter in there. Graham, who's been in the stream a few times, plays him, and I don't think he's hardly ever been in melee. He stays out. He's an elf with a high dexterity and a bow. Oh,
then you should definitely be playing to your strength for that point.
And he does, yeah. He stays out of combat and he peppers whatever's easiest with arrows, and he's been very effective.
Exactly, but you're still having the expectations that if someone makes a fighter, you expect him to be at the front.
Yeah.
Because that's where it all goes. And yeah, Omen Owl is right. Longbow fighters are great protectors from the rear, far behind.
You can have them in the second rank as well. Give them a spear.
Easily.
Give a fighter a spear in the second rank, and brilliant. You've got more people being able to attack.
Oh, absolutely. And especially if you're allowing the whole, if you're allowing the house rule of, you can have someone at the front, sword and board, spear, allowing to leap over the other character, because then you can start having, first formation, second formation, third, and so on. But I don't think there are specific rules in AD&D 1E for that. I mean, you're going to have to correct me if I'm wrong on that. But this is where you can start seeing a build-up amongst the different classes. And this is then where a character, a person of persona would start having to step out. If a fighter has a low intelligence, you can, as a DM, easily turn around and say, why are you suggesting a phalanx? Why are you suggesting your standard, front line, second line, and so on? Tactics, you've got a whopping intelligence of 7 and less. Where is this coming from?
Yeah, I mean, you could, if that fighter's got to 5th or 6th level experience, you could turn around and say, well, he's got a bit of experience now. But he might not choose the right option for the right moment.
Yeah,
I mean, talking about different types of fighter. I mean, I joined a 2nd edition game when I came back to the hobby, and going back to last week's session 0, I met the prospective DM in a pub, and we sat and had a beer. He made sure I wasn't an absolute imbecile. He may or may not have been right, but he let me into the group, and we rolled a character there and then in the pub, and 4d6 rearrange, and the stats I got were not very high.
Yep.
It was something like 15, 12, 11, 9, 7, 6. Something like that. I put the 15 on dexterity. I put the 7 on wisdom, the 6 on intelligence. And I said to the DM, am I okay having a decent sized bow at first level? He says, yeah, you can have a bow. I said, well, okay, he's going to have cheap armor. He's going to carry a light melee weapon. But I'm thinking of making him a tribesman. Does that really fit into your world? He's not. He's going to be illiterate. He's going to believe he's the greatest hunter and bowman alive. But he's going to be sadly wrong because he clearly isn't. Not yet. Mm-hmm. He's going to be overconfident in his abilities. But at the same time, people are going to find it hard to dislike him because he's just a bit of a fool, a bit of a likable fool. He means well. And from those ability scores and the fact that I picked a fighter, I'd got a character and a personality there ready to go that was something different to the standard sword and board.
Absolutely. That's a great way of sort of filling it in, but more important thing is you checked with the DM, what your idea is. Does that fit the world? Great. Here's the character concept that I have. Here's how I want to incorporate the personality with the class. Here's how I want to use the class to work with the character. And you were trying to sort of build that back and forth, using one to support the other and vice versa. And that's really, that's the key thing that I usually try to encourage, especially new players when they start out. And that's usually a big thing, because I often see that people, newer players will come in and be like, and say, here is my concept. It's like, well, great. So you want to have this kind of personality. How are you going to be supporting this in order to have success? Because at the end of the day, it's fun when you win. It's fun when you are getting challenged. So it's
most importantly, how does it fit within this with the game world and the group?
Exactly, and that's what, at least I'm going to use my real life 5th edition group just for this brief example. I was sitting down with each of the players, and I was really trying to understand, what is it that you want to play? What is it that will be fun for you? One player said, I really want to be a samurai, but I don't want to lose out on magic. It's like, right, we will make you a fighter. You will focus on fighter. You'll dip in a little bit to be a sorcerer, because then that way you don't have to worry about books and all of these other things. We'll do this and do that. You can run around with some armor. We will work this out this way so that you can have the aesthetic that you want. We have our introduction in an area that would justify him being from a very oriental background. And then I went through for every single player to make sure that what they had was also in a direction where they could have a class that would give them some support, or at least mechanically, for what they wanted. And what we've then learned later on is that some players realized, well, what their concept has evolved. And then with that, they've had to review what the class is and how they want that to support the character. I get this. Go on.
What do you feel about the current sort of attitude of pretty much you need a class or a background for everything, and that that players' character concepts need to be backed up by mechanics at all times?
I come from the school of thinking of look at the party as a whole and look at what roles are being filled. Because I've played for so long that when I come in as a player, I don't look at what do I want to play. I look at the group and go, what will the group as a whole find enjoyment from having in addition? What holes can I plug? What safeguards can I provide? Now, in terms of what the culture of players coming in with preconceived characters built, they don't even have numbers, they don't have a character sheet, they don't even understand what the class that they're picking really means. I find it that it's good. The enthusiasm is fantastic. The imagination is something I would never ever tell anyone, cut down on that. I often have to remind players, you're level 1. If we're beginning at level 1, let's take this idea and let's scale it a bit back. These are great ideas. Some of these things, let's turn that into goals and so on and so on. Come at me with the energy. Let me take parts of this and
the character has to be created initially within the constraints of the power level and the game mechanics.
Exactly. But most of what players then come to me with, or what I've at least seen with their backgrounds and so on, if most games in 5th edition, which often I see people advertise it to be starting at level 3, you can easily take most of the backgrounds and be like, yeah, no, you went fighting orcs and goblins and all that. You could definitely have achieve this in order to have this background to explain why you have gone from level 1 to level 3.
But if you start at level 1, no, you haven't done all that. But that's it. You want to do all that. Exactly. Make it a goal.
Quick answer for a squirrel. At the moment, we're talking about 5th edition, but we're trying to bring it back to AD&D 1E, just so that we can stay on the core bit. But we might bounce a bit.
I think we should. I mean, we've got to sort of take into account various versions of the game and various different games
that's true.
Experience with, because obviously class mechanics are different across different games.
To bring it back to the topic, people. There's a lot of focus right now on the character, the story. How the characters impact the story and so forth. And it's really. I often find that, yes, it's really important for you to have a character, but it's equally so, it's important for you to understand your class, because if you can't have a class, if you don't understand your class, you don't know how you can support your character in that essence, because the class is where a lot of the meat and potatoes are. It's the mechanics, it's the system, it's the things that will allow your character to stand out and to be a beacon. It will allow them to have their niche within the group. And that's an important thing. Niche protection is an important thing. It's a very vital thing that players need to understand, that everyone has to have a function. There can be cross functions, absolutely, but someone still has to be, able to do something. You can't spread yourself too thin, like thin butter across a piece of bread. You'll be drawn out and you feel that you're not succeeding in something.
I'd say about niche protection, we also had a stream about this a little while ago, but with the general theme at the moment of a lot, certainly with D&D being a class and skill-based game, the niche protection is somewhat lost by the fact that a number of the skills are aspects of a variety of classes. So you don't have those niches as clearly as you used to have. Which I think is a real shame.
It is. I do agree, and I often, at least again, I'm going to use my 5th edition as an example here. I've tried to bring niches and niche protection into my group to basically go, you're doing this, you're doing that, so on. Not by directly telling the player, but by allowing them to sort of find their own way, find the skills, and by allowing them to creatively turn around and say, can I do this? Or tell me, I want to achieve this. I don't know how this mechanically works. And then we go through with how they can go through with doing this, how they can use spells. I mean, especially when you start looking at spell casters, arcana, anything that would allow them to sort of, just study magic, basic cantrips. I mean, even if we just turn around and say, okay, you don't need to have the specific spell of, this, but you can still try and poke and prod to get an idea of something. So that's one way that you can bring that out. And again, this is where the players, can sort of play into their characters, and they can all coordinate by having their classes support them, or their character can use the class and focus on that as a strength.
And I mean, about Halakar's comment here. I think one of the issues we've got with the current state of play, where there are a wide variety of classes and defined archetypes in the rules, is that people lose sight somewhat of the inherent flexibility that lies within the original 4 core classes. As Halakar says here, a fighter can fill many roles and still be a fighter. It's a little more difficult with a thief because of their defined skills, but you can still have certainly second edition corrected that in some way, with being able to assign skills, and you get various different types. You can have different types of magic user, and again, second edition defined that. I think clerics, and certainly the cleric and the druid as a subclass, were a little bit more like the fighter in that the range of clerical spells you could have, it was possible to have, even in the basic first edition D&D, you could have a war cleric, a healer cleric, a divination cleric. You could do that. You could do that quite easily. But I think fighter is quite simply the most versatile in terms of what you can make of it.
But it's, I mean, this is, I don't want to get into game design because it's not the important topic of today, but a fighter as a class and as a character is expected to come into a group and be able to fill and plug holes where there is need for physical activities.
Yes.
Whether it is at the front, whether it is peppering from afar, whether it is hauling out treasure or bashing down walls because the elf knows there is a secret door behind here. I just don't know where. Well, wonderful thing. I have a 2-handed hammer and there is a wall here. Just, hammer meet brick.
And I've got big strength and I've got a chance of doing it.
Exactly. So it's very important for that. Going to the thief. Now, this is just where we might have to be splitting it a little bit, because I think thieves, at least in second edition, has been given more opportunity to spread out, not just in terms of the proficiencies and skills that they can have there, but also in terms of their ability to assign their percentages.
That's what I meant.
Sorry. Okay. When you were saying skills, I was thinking proficiencies. I was like, well, they get a lot of proficiencies, and they get. Okay, yeah, perfect. But yeah, the percentages, they get to do that. That you get to really fine tune yours that way. But additionally, I know the proficiencies also exist in first edition as an optional rule. But that's because the focus in first edition is more about roll a d20 against the stats. DM says yay or nay. Go on from there. Second edition is just trying to go like, well, let's just actually put some writing to this, and then we'll take it from there. For me, it's easier to look down and go, right, this is a great guideline for me to then say these things go to that, and then you could. Some things are just harder to do than others. Like, well, if you aren't let's see, tracking gives us 0, but what was it? It is engineer. No, it is spellcraft that always begins with a -1 because of the amount of information a wizard has to cram into their mind. Pure and simple, spellcraft is just arcana. It is just, here is me rolling to see whether I can identify the magic that is being used. And that's technically it's a thing that a cleric or a priest could also attempt to do if they've got any insights for the arcanes. But then they have to go out of their way to invest into it and break through, the expectations of what a priest can and can't do. Good so far.
So spellcraft. Are you talking third edition by this point? I'm guessing.
No. There is a specific proficiency you can buy in second edition. That's called spellcraft. It is just arcana that we would know from like 3.5 and onwards.
As in the non-weapon proficiencies.
Yes, it's a non-weapon proficiency. That I believe in first edition, it's just a case of like, can the wizard identify what's supposed to be being cast? quick intelligence roll. Yeah, they know what's going on. Second edition, they just went, oh, it's a specific thing that you can technically have. But the question then becomes, how can a wizard ever not have it? And then we can see that spiraled into later editions where they went, well, all wizards will now have spellcraft and so on. But that's its own can of worms. These are things. These are the skills, the abilities, the insights. These are all things that a class gets flavor from. And whether
Yes.
you're then turning around and saying, again, if you're sticking to first edition, this is basically down to what makes the character. What's the rough idea? What do they do when they're not out adventuring? Breaking down doors, doing enter and robbery, against the innocent goblins and the industrial orcs who are just looking to break out of the economy and become independent. They still do something. There's still something that they do. All right, let's see some comments.
Yeah, let's have a few comments. Ian says, when you moved to playing first edition AD&D, I found we were taking more care to build things because there were more options, and those dictated the character rather than the freedom of our imagination. I certainly see that in later editions after first edition. I mean, maybe 1.5, where you sort of had Unearthed Arcana and stuff like that added, and Wilderness, the survival guides, or Oriental Adventures, which had the non-weapon proficiencies and all those in 1985. I think they were introduced. But I thought the core first edition was still quite limiting in terms of player options, which left more in the hands of the player imagination. And I prefer it that way.
I'm of the same. Well, my 1E is very rusty. My base understanding is a lot of 1E left the finer details outside of the mechanics to the player. Mm-hmm. They could decide if their fighter was a manual worker who has just been drafted into the militia, stood out a little bit, and then went on. Or they could decide that they are actually someone who is a page who got kicked out, but they have the training of being the progeny of a potential knight, and therefore they've got these things. It was open to such a wide thing from what I've read.
The 1E Dungeon Master's Guide had a table that the players could roll on, which gave them a profession, and then that could be used to assume certain types of knowledge during the game. And that was the idea of it. Rather than having specific proficiencies, it would be just like my fighter. I've rolled I was a farmer, therefore do I know whether this land is good for farming? And the DM would be like, okay, you've got a background of being a farmer. You would have some idea. It's that sort of basic stuff that can give those little bits of flavor. As I've got older, I prefer that to the idea of having distinct professions, distinct proficiencies. I mean,
but I like to actually take both. So I'll take the distinct proficiencies that are specifically for the class. Oops, don't know if you can hear that, but basically. The specific class proficiencies to help sort of like formulate and mold a class specifically to give them a different sense of like what they are. So typically, a fighter will probably take things like, oh, I'm a hunter or I'm a blacksmith and things like that to, give them some sort of like capabilities to make themselves, more self-sufficient in a way, able to look after themselves or contribute.
If I combine the two, I'd have them pick or roll on that table. And then say, okay, you can have some proficiencies, but those are the ones that will be associated with whatever you got on that table.
Yeah. So
to give them a bit more logic.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I suggest, I encourage rolling because you don't, at least in the medieval times, it's not like you got to choose, what you really had for a profession. You were born into a family, that family had a profession, you were going to inherit that profession and so on. But I'm not hard on that rule. So I've had a player who rolled up a bard and he said, I want my father to be a shipwright. So I have broken off from family tradition, but I still understand the building of boats and the general concepts of these things. It's not
Yeah,
a
that's fine.
profession.
That's absolutely fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was his background. That was, that's where he came from. He's got insights for this mild bit of carpentry, building of boats, a little bit of testing of the buoyancy. I agreed he could have a little bit of swimming, nothing too serious.
And he
It's
might
not
be able
like
to look
he's
at the stars and navigate a little bit by them.
Yeah,
Perhaps.
well, I didn't actually allow him to have any form of navigation because as a shipwright, you're a builder
Right,
more
so-
than you're an actual sailor. So I had to be hard at some points, but that was the background. And I told the players, use your background to explain things. And I had, I had an elf. One of the players picked a wizard, thief, and decided that his background was a hunter. Just so so he was focused on hunting, tracking, and all that. But because he was of the elven nature, the argument was that, well, as an elf, I love nature, so I go out between my studies and I run out and I've got. He had a very low wisdom, so it was the whole idea of like, I've done my studies now, out for freedom, kind of mentality that he had when he was younger. But then the focus became down for proficiencies. These are specific things and skills that will make your class support your character concepts further on a mechanical thing. So that can be anywhere from what you decide that you want to do that will have actual mechanical benefits, like a fighter choosing to have weaponsmithing, or a wizard choosing that he wants to have engineering for future ideas of building and what have you, which it's all down to the creativity. And that's how I like to do it, because that way you've got both a job that you do when you're not adventuring, and you've got skills that you are specifically honed for your adventuring when you're out and about, so that you've got a little bit more sort of to it. That's a long rant. Sorry, your turn.
No, that's how I tend to view it as well, in that and Halakar said here he likes the old secondary profession idea because it gives more freedom for the player's imagination, and I think it does. I think if you've got almost too many defined options, makes the players almost feel constrained on within some tracks. If you start saying, okay, you've got these 4 skills, a player might think, well, that's all I've got. And I have found that happen. I've seen it happen many, many times. If you just say, well, you were a miner, it's then up to the player to decide how that would affect things, rather than saying a miner. Okay, a miner makes you able to recognize different types of ore, some basic appraising of the quality of the ore, and maybe a bit of knowledge about sort of smelting procedures and tools. They then think that's all they can do, but you can come up with other things, like maybe the engineering of mines or whatever.
I also try to encourage people. I mean, one, I like history. I like to encourage people to go out and educate themselves, a little bit. What was it like in the medieval times? What were some of the professions at the time? And what was that? So I've often, I've often played around with the idea of like, well, I want to make a character where I am, I can't remember what the exact title was, but you are considered to be one of the social undesirables because all you do every day is lug shit out of the toilets. And you are considered to be such a low member of the social standing that most people look at you and go, I will not even talk to you. But it will be a great thing, because then this character having people that literally will allow him to, or that's willing to be friends with him, is like, oh, this is the most important thing in my life. Like, I really need to be good with these people because I get to have a social life. I get to do this. Yes, Elfbader's just jumped in. Gong farmer, exactly. Got to harvest all the wonderful nutrients of
but then we get the character's skills and background. In your instance, there it'd be bleeding into their personality.
It would,
and I want to see that.
But exactly.
yes, the player, as far as I'm concerned, the player does have complete freedom of personality of the character, but I do like to see it when it makes sense.
It should make sense, and it should contribute. So that's the important thing. There should be contributions from the class, the things that build up the mechanical parts into the actual character and their persona. Huntsman. Like, again, I'm going to use my second edition player here, who went thief, wizards, and has the background of a hunter. He loves being, on his own. He's built a house, he's bought land, a lot acres of land, so that he could clear out a specific part, have his house, and live as far as away from people. Why? Because he's a hunter. He likes being on his own. He'll come into town for supplies, but he likes the idea of, like, I've got my own isolated place. I'm self-sufficient. I've got my own thing here. As a hunter, that's it. Another player has a background of a nobleman. Well, he's the lord of a manor now. And he's got, the persona of, like, I am here, I am in charge. And the group has just, even though the group internally agrees that the elf is technically in charge, from an outsider's perspective, it's actually the lord who is in charge at all times. Because even though that character who is the lord has got a charisma of 8, just your typical person, nothing outstanding, he is perceived as being the power base because he has a big imposing name. He has a big imposing
that would then
personality.
create interesting role-playing situations whereby they will be addressing the character who they believe is in charge, who is the Lord. And of course, he's got a poor charisma, so it'll be foot in mouth. And yeah.
And this has happened on several occasions. There's been several times where, the grand leader, the Lord, has, had to stand there and, like, address people. And I've said, okay, you are in a situation where words can really sway, but this is where your charisma, your personality is. I mean, the players are great role player, don't get me wrong. I will hands down for that. But I have to then look at his character and say, you have to roll to see how well your charisma influences these things.
Yes.
And then this is where your class and your attributes comes in. And I don't have the paper in front of me, but I've got the little reaction rolls and how things are, if they're indifferent, if they're cautious, hostile, or how
is that second edition?
That is a second edition, but you can easily take it across.
Yeah. I'm saying, are you playing second edition really with it for that?
For that one, yes. Yeah, I stick to what I know best for that one.
That's one of my favorite mechanics in second edition, is the way they took that table and created that reaction roll table and really made something of it and made something logical.
Great. Great.
Owen Owl says here, he says, my issue is many skills are very broad, and others in the same system are very niche. But often those niche skills are the ones, to me, that give more flavor. And I think it's up to the player to bring some of those skills into play, not by asking for rolls, but by just sort of inquiring during the game and trying to bring them to the fore.
I have to agree with Omen Owl that there are many skills that are very broad.
Yeah,
the one that always is perception, but the one that always crops up to me is survival.
Yeah,
because then that suddenly becomes anything from tracking to foraging to all of these other things. And I often look at survival and go, this is something where I always try to put a much harder sense of, like, parameters for what you can use certain skills for, because I'm conscious that if you are, again, I'm going to use survival. If you're overusing survival, why don't you have a ranger in your group? Okay, if we use AD&D systems, I understand why you don't have a ranger, because the restrictions to have to be a ranger is really high. So you would need to, at the very least, have a background of being a huntsman, a gatherer, or some form of tracker. At that point, fine, I can absolutely understand it, and you should definitely be using that as an excuse. But the 3.5, the third edition onwards, survival, I just start looking and going, like, why don't you have at least someone that can justifiably turn around and say, I can use this on a consistent level?
Equally, though, that's one skill that I found in 5th edition is only really used at low levels, because there's so many options as characters move up through the levels to just be able to hand wave away the benefits of that skill.
Yeah,
And I think it's a shame.
Yeah, but 5th edition also goes more towards like the high magic kind of environments where a lot of things can sort of be just waved away by, oh, we're thirsty, create food and water, do this, don't worry about that, summon out water, these sort of things. There are certain things you can get, but it's down to what you, as a team, as a group, has agreed to what you want to play as. I'm sure if you went very hard in and started to turn around and say, well, it's now winter and you don't have any heat and you need this and that. Omen is pointing out later that fire starting and rope use is.
We appear to. Oh, we've got to go away. Let's block the. Oh no, I didn't mean to share it.
Yes,
go away. Go away. Yeah, block user. That's what I wanted. There we go. There we go. Okay, and I'm just going to say hello. One of my players is here. Hello. Fancy seeing you here. We didn't have a game on Monday, so he's clearly feeling withdrawal symptoms. So yes, I am Scorchy is one of the. I would say my players. Mike DMs. Myself and Mike take it in turns to DM, so he plays under both me and Mike. So there we go. Time to cast protection from bots. You are correct, Mage's Music. It's been a while since we've had a bot infestation, but I'll try to react quickly. But my dexterity is getting a bit dodgy these days. Right? Yeah. So fire starting and rope use. They are quite niche. But
So again, I want to at least jump out and defend why they're very useful. What is the environment you're in?
Yes. Yeah.
Are you mountaineering? Rope use. Rope use. You don't want that knot giving up on you while you're descending. Oh heavens.
Again, going back to boats. Rope use. Rope use is very use. And of course, if you're a hangman.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
You definitely need to know that.
Fire starting. I'm a fire starter, twisted fire starter, as the song says. A lot of assumption is made that you can start fires, and unless you're sort of DM who throws a lot of bad weather and makes it matter, then fire starting does tend to get forgotten.
Again, the fire starting again. I think in the prospect of, in these medieval times, if you didn't know how to start a fire, you were going to be cold very often, and that would lead to a very short life expectancy. So most people knew how to start a fire under ideal circumstances, i.e. no water, no wind, no nothing. Fire
and no
starting,
time pressure. No time
exactly,
pressure.
No time pressure. Now, fire starting as a skill, if I ever played a ranger, I would be hauling myself towards that skill immediately, because I've watched so many YouTube videos about people who go out into the wilderness and just go, well, it's snowing, it's absolutely shit, you're cold, how do you start a fire? Let's get started. And then they actually go through about, like, you build up shelter this way, here's how you do it, here's the things you bring with you, because you're ideally, someone who knows the woods, you bring this kind of equipment with you, so on and so on. This is the sort of thing that you can take a skill, and this will make everything different. Because if you don't have rations, that will be filling, and it's raining, and it's dark. Well, you need to have some form of food, or you need to have some form of heat. And if you are adventuring, and I don't know why you ever would be adventuring during the fall and winter, you need to know how to stay warm. Again, if the DM takes weather and temperatures into account, which I do, I absolutely do. I've tortured my players by putting them through environments where it was suddenly 38 to 45 degrees Celsius. The players were all sitting going, we're dead. We are dying. We are running from shade to shade to shade because it was too warm. and now they're heading towards winter, and I'm going to bring them out Norwegian winters, very cold winters, where if they decided that they wanted to go adventuring, it's one of those things where you almost want to like pack up firewood because you're going to need it.
And I think a lot depends on the system you're playing as well, and the expectations of how the system will play out. I mean, I'm running a couple of MERP games at the moment, and skills like fire starting in a system which is designed to be lower fantasy and with a lot more environmental elements. It can be something that's very, very useful. But I did want to say just a quick minute, because he is a player. He is a player with us. I'm glad you find them useful. That they're meant to be useful. Role playing, there's only, as I said in my video I did the other day, there's only one wrong way to role play, and that's a way that is not fun for everybody else. Everything else is fine. Just do whatever is most fun for you and for the group as a whole. That's it. Right. So where? Yeah, well, 35 to 40 degrees Omanal is not normal here. I can tell you that now. We are Europeans, and if it gets over 25 degrees, we start moaning. If it gets under 10 degrees, we start moaning. If it rains, we moan. If it doesn't rain, we moan. If it gets slightly windy, we moan. And if it snows, the whole country grinds to a halt.
The country shuts down, I'll tell you right now.
Because we are pathetic. We are pathetic.
And I was shocked when I lived in the Netherlands and it snowed and everything just collapsed down. No infrastructure, no one could drive. There was no salt on the road. I was just, what is this? I'm like, Denmark does not get that much snow, but we know that when there is a forecast of potential snow, there is salt all over the place. People just drown out the road in salt just to be ready.
Anyway, let's go back to characters and
characters and classes.
Yes.
Let's go over to something that's different then, because I think where we are going to have a class that has a big influence on the character is the priest or the clerics.
Yes.
Because of the god that they will be deciding. And that is, in my view, that is a very important thing. When you decide what god you're going to be putting yourself down as, what deity has chosen you, or what you are going to be worshipping, that would be something that should be reflecting in. Yes, General, you're very right. But my point is, the priest, their persona would almost be reflecting in the deity that they are following.
Yes,
because there will be something in that priest would be a reflection of said in their personality would be reflected. A warrior priest, aggressive, up, probably going to be much like a fighter, ready to throw down if they need to, but they will also know the calm before the storm and so forth. There should be some elements.
More than any other class, this needs to be thought about by the player beforehand. I mean, 9 times out of 10, when I make a character, I don't think too deeply about how they're going to be beforehand until I get to the table and just see what comes out. But with the priest, the choice of deity is going to have a big impact right from the get-go as to how that character should be played.
Absolutely.
If you are a priest of a god of healing, then quite simply, you are going to be helpful. You are going to be kind. You are going to put value into life. If you are a priest of a god of trickery, then you're probably going to be deceitful. These are all little things that will be in the character when the character is made, and the player needs to decide from the get-go. But equally, the priest is a very, very flexible class. The generic first edition priest, as I've already said, there's so much flexibility in how you play them, even if you're not specifically tying them into an existing pantheon. I mean, I know in basic D&D there were no real gods. It just said your god, gives you it, and it was left open. It was just left open there.
No, absolutely, and it's a very important thing, and it's also important, especially for the GM, because this is where the world building comes in. Because what are the existing gods? Is it a pantheon? Is it a multi different religions with very strong beliefs? How does that work out? So that's for the DM to then come and work in, and then you will. At least in my experience, there are going to be the player who will say, "I would like to play the priest for the god of death." I was like, right. Let's take this on then. Because are we then talking
doesn't
about?
Have to be evil though. Doesn't have to be evil.
They can be just a part of nature. I mean,
exactly.
I played an actual evil priest of the god of death, but I masqueraded myself as being a good priest of the god of life and death, because I would have the symbol of the god of death on one hand tied around my wrist, the god of life tied around my other wrist, and just go, one heals, one takes away life. It's just the circle of life. Like, I am not doing anything abnormal here. People will die, whether of old age or anything. I am here to ease them through life, full stop.
Right, I am going to introduce somebody else into the stream, a familiar voice, a very familiar voice. And as I introduced you as the lawful evil master of the whip, keeping us all in line, this, I would say, Omen Owl is very much a bard, because he is a master of regaling us on the various topics we talk about.
Uh-oh.
Hello, how are you?
Hopefully it's the first edition, not a second or later.
The first edition bard, the jack of all trades. Yeah, not the dodgy bard.
No, I mean, looking at some of these, and we're talking about it, and I'll go a little bit. Is I know you talked about thieves. I think that, and I know I put this up there, is because you could only attempt the skill once per level, and if you look at the original. If you look at a lot of the design, it's really meant for about 8 players. And the assumption is you're going to have 2 of each, is my guess. And so then that allowed people to do their own little niche specialization, even though they may be identical on paper. And depending on how you rolled, also depending on where you're going through. Now, if you're using method 4, you can rearrange as you want. But if you're using one of the method like 0, just straight 3d6, or one of those that are just pretty much wherever you roll, that's where your stats are. Then you can have a much greater range that the fighter doesn't always have the highest strength. He might have a decent strength and a high constitution and a high dexterity. So at that point, that would change where you will be in what role or capacity you have. I'm going to bring up other game systems too. I think that I don't like the skills the way they're done in D&D, but if you're going to do them, make them very, very broad, because they don't give you very many skills. Now, if you're using something like Paladin, which is one that has a true class bloat, if anyone's ever seen that one, we have a ranger over here, and then we have an archer over here, and they're only different by like 2 skills. I think that's one of the things where they really need to pair it off. And sometimes, you still had the assumption that if you fell as a ranger, you fell as a fighter, you became fell as a paladin, you became a fighter. And I think that I understand where that comes from, and I think that we've missed some of that, because you're really going, where does the barbarian fit in compared to the fighter? They're almost the exact same role in the current edition, and I think that's one of those that would have been better if they'd really stuck with the top 4 classes and had created the subclass barbarian, subclass paladin, or a subclass ranger, and made them more of a prestige. That's my view on some of that.
That's about the barbarian. That's one reason why I like to differentiate it from the fighter, by making the barbarian very much a cultural class. If you pick a barbarian in a game that I'm running, then I expect you to play a character who is from a tribe, who does not live in cities, who's used to being nomadic, who will have a life without the same sort of degree of structure as you will have in a city, and different expectations. And I would expect that to help to shape the personality of the character, because I see that class as being different Though you can, obviously, in a system which doesn't have a barbarian, such as Core First Edition before Unearthed Arcana, you can simulate a barbarian by having a fighter, by just playing a fighter in a barbarian manner. That's perfectly possible.
Now, no, you didn't have access to Dragon Magazine, but I remember having
No, I didn't.
And some of them, I think, were joke classes, and some of them, I think, were kind of brought out there. Well, I mean, even though almost all of the April Fool's editions were great, they were fun to listen to, even though the Cavalier came out of one of those. But they had a class like the Duelist. What was it? It was like the Sentinel or something like that. They actually had a bureaucrat and a politician as their own separate classes. Now, I think those were kind of jokes, but they weren't in the edition where I had it. And I think that was the big weakness in first edition, is by forcing them into those to make them better. I agree with you. The point is that when you take a class, it's supposed to fill a niche. And some of those niches were supposed to be in between. And I understand that, but I would have preferred them to have done I know we talk about multi-class, but if they just simply said, okay, a paladin will be a fighter cleric, I would have been okay with that. Or, and some of those I think would have been a little bit better in that aspect. Unfortunately, they didn't really do that. But when we're also talking classes, is if you're looking at other systems, where does maybe you guys are familiar with, but like Alien, you can pick several different ones, and they have special abilities that are outside of the normal skill system. Like almost everything's rolled in a skill system, but their special abilities allow them to do, I can push this roll, or I can do this versus this. I can reduce stress, or I can ignore panic. And I think that's the other thing that we can look at for just different games. And I know Saxy says like talking game design, but to me, it's always about game design, because that's what I like to talk about is, where does it fit in the game design? Otherwise, why do we even have the rules? Because we need to really understand where the game design is coming from and whether it's enhancing the game that we're playing or not.
I mean, obviously, we're focusing on class and how class impacts character so much in this one. And I'm going to bring in the game I've been playing a fair bit recently, and that is Middle-earth. I don't know how familiar either of you are. I know a couple of people have been playing in MERP games in chat. A couple of people in chat have been playing Middle-earth games with me recently. In Middle-earth, at low levels, class doesn't have a great deal of impact on what your character can and can't do. Most of that comes from the racial background of the character. At first level, a hobbit warrior will be better at hiding than almost any other race as a scout, which is the equivalent of the thief, because it is drawn from the race. But then when you gain levels, you get points to put into each skill group. And the scout class gets more to put in subterfuge skills. So that's where the scout will gain as it goes through, develop as it goes through levels. But at low level, if you just pick an Eriadorian man as a scout, he's not going to be particularly good at anything scout related. And more of that's going to come from the race. But I do feel in Tolkien's world that a lot of the character personality is meant to come from the race. Because there are defined characteristics of each group of men, each type of elf, each dwarves. The book actually defines personality traits of all of those races to help play the character. So there's less coming from the class there. There's more coming from the race of the character.
That's also a big thing, at least in the Tolkien world, where a lot of the different kingdoms had got very unique personalities. They've got very unique cultures that was very deeply entrenched into them, and that was meant to be something that was brought out. I mean, if we look at the Rohirrim, for example, and how they really are valuing, the freedom that they have with their horses, the horse lords, the fact that they can ride out upon anywhere. We've got the East Mark and the West Mark. That is literally how they define the different fields of their kingdom. It's just East, West, and these are just giant marks of lands that they have. Whereas, the Gondorians, very centralized, grand buildings, descendants of the Númenóreans. You've got this long heritage that follows with them, and it just continues on from there. So that's a major thing that we should be playing in. And
Yes.
it's in that sense, it's a big impact. It's very important. And you are right, Owen. The game mechanics and the game design is an important thing. Just to bring it back to the topic, it's just I was trying to focus on what does the class bring, and how do we have preconceived notions for that impacting the kind of character that will be played.
I think I agree with you on that, and that's kind of why I wish they had done. And this is what I was talking about. And I know 3E did it, but I think they did it too low of a level considering how things go. I guess. It's really favoring people not working that hard to get certain things. But those subclass features where you can really differentiate yourself, I thought that would have added a lot more if it was at a higher level. And I felt the same way for 1E, that if they had made it so you had prestige classes. And I know when I used to play video games, they started doing this early on. Oh, you've done a fighter, but because you've been following the path of, let's say you've been following the path of a cavalier, you get these special abilities over here. You've been following the path of a paladin, you can now cast spells. Or you've done ranger, which I don't know why in the world they put in magic user and stuff, but it would have been nice if they'd done just the druid. Now you get these tracking abilities, and that would have made it feel a lot more like John was talking about with the Middle Earth. Is all of a sudden now you're fifth level. If you're being called a ranger, that actually means something. Those Dunedain rangers are really experienced characters. They're not just, I just got off the farm and this is what I'm going to be.
Well, we did see part of that when we move into 3rd edition 3.5, where you would have a multitude of prestige classes to sort of show the growth of the class and the character as they would be progressing on throughout their adventures. They would learn certain skills, they would redesign themselves and become a more either focused or more broader capable character or class even that would allow them to go through that. Now, that was how it was at least done in that sense to help with the progression. But I don't. It's just maybe my preference, but I think you don't need the whole prestige things. Often I find that the core 4 classes are a good start. Then once you start adding in the sub classes like the paladins and the rangers and so forth, that's where you can get more specialized kind of flavoring that you would want.
The other part talk about with 5e, we look at the skills, but I actually like the optional rule for either using attributes or whatever you define your profession. As long as you can argue that your profession has it, I'll let you roll as if you're skilled in that rather than something else. So like if you say, well, okay, I'm going to tie these knots for rope use, well, that's great, but it doesn't tell you how you're going to climb up it doesn't tell you how you're going to scale the mountain, because those are different styles of knots and climbing and what you'd be using for. But I think that, the more that I look at it, I'm not trying, as much as a lot of people not 5e, I think there's some really good rules in that Dungeon Master's Guide, and if they would just be followed, you could get a much more 1E feel without overcomplicating everything.
One thing I may say, going about class mechanics helping define the character, I certainly think that those classes that had a wider variety of alignment options had wider variety of character personality and character ideas that could be role played into them. Those were a lot more niche in terms of what alignments they were allowable. They were used to guide those classes in a certain manner. The Paladin is the obvious one. Yes, there's a lot of ways of playing lawful good, but essentially a Paladin has to stand up for the law and stand up for the downtrodden. Simple as that.
You can also just take the druids.
Yeah,
True
nature.
neutral. It has to be about, if you argue about the whole balance of finding, the right ecosystem, maintaining the whole, ecosphere and everything that follows with it, the hierarchy of it. That's a very important thing. And that often require, in my experience, it would require the druid player to actively sort of, go out of the way to learn about what is the local environment now at, because they will always have things that will be tipping it left and right and center. Yeah. But it's also worth, finding out, what a part of nature is, that, some things will give, some things will be allowed to grow. It's about finding out, when is the balance actually at stake, and when does, and when does a druid, when are they able to sort of lean back and just say, well, this is nature taking its natural course? And often, more times than not, I just find that the answer is it the nature of animals, or is it the nature of humanoids that's interfering with the environment? And then from there,
the main reason a druid would adventure is because more often than not, it's evil that is tipping the balance out.
Oh, more often than not, and it's often, you have to go out afar to protect your home. That's pure and simple, because by the time it arrives to your footstep, to your doorstep, it's often too late at that point to do anything. That's why, a druid is incentivized to go out and to do anything. That's just overlooking the whole thing of, if we're doing AD&D rules of, when you are a druid, you're technically still an initiate at a very low level, and you're building your way up the ranks until you reach 9 or 10, and you actually gain the title of druid, and you're then given a grove and everything that follows with that. But then that's where AD&D goes into the higher level of gaming, and then that's whether or not the group wants to actually do that. But that's also a big one where, again, you're playing a druid, you have expectations. Your class comes with certain expectations that you will be behaving, with the argument of, you can't kill someone because it's going to upset the balance. Okay. Then you, as a group, you normally have to try and find ways around that. Equally so, if someone says that they're going to play Paladin, you have to sit down and go, well, what do I want to play versus what can the group work with?
And these are classes that do impose themselves on all the other members of the group as well.
Very much so. Hell, even a ranger is going to be imposing upon the group, because you're not going to be seeing a group being allowed to say, well, we're going to deal with this problem by starting a forest fire with a ranger in their group. That will not happen. That's where, the DM will turn, smile, and look at the ranger, because this is where they have to step up.
Yeah. And what are you going to say about that then? Yeah, exactly.
Well, and I'm going to have to laugh at that, because, where we're saying that, you won't catch everything on fire, and yet, at least in North America, fire is a necessary portion of actually burning things and clearing out undergrowth for here. So
it depends on what obviously, if there is a purpose for the ecosystem, to controlled burning, then fine. But as a form of destruction, then
what we think is, and I think this is what's the interesting part, and this happens also in England, where they would, if you look at some of the old trees, and they actually have, the limbs that are straight, because they would make them into fence posts and things like that. It's a lot of people train these things, and I think as a druid, the idea really comes down to, you're allowed to do it as long as you're not upsetting a huge major portion of the balance. The same thing with the ranger, but I think it's very different to compare Europe to like North America, where fire is an absolute necessity. So to burn the forest down is not really even considered a negative thing. We consider it negative nowadays, but I like in Florida, holy hell, I saw what they did with the burns, and they cut down trees that were 150 feet tall so they could make it more natural.
You still have cycles of when this will happen. The fires are not something that you're going to be having outside of specific times where the undergrowth is now going out of control. We're now doing this to sort of like bring it back into this session. There's a reason for why, in order to maintain the nature that you would do it. Whereas the exact scenario I'm bringing up is where the group went, there are monsters in here. We don't want to go out there and deal with it. A forest fire, just to sort of like spread it out there and deal with them that way. Go on.
Oh no, I agree with you on that. But then again, you're kind of going, as a DM, I remember doing that, saying, "Well, let's go look at this banner." I said, "Why don't we just burn the house down?" And they're just like, "No, we can't do that." Really?
Well, I think
that will save us a lot of time.
I think Lord Fullmind basically says right here, the druid might be okay with a fire. A ranger is also going to be concerned about whoever lives in the forest.
Yeah.
Now, I think the druid might also be concerned, but it depends on who or what is in the forest.
Well, if let's jump into this, because the forest is not just going to be having the animals. We're going to have the Sylvans, we're going to have the Fae, we're going to be having the Treants, and these are creatures of a world that will react extraordinarily negative if they suddenly turn around and go, "Oh, that's a fire. Who could have started this? Well, we do know about this human civilization nearby. Should we pay them a visit?" So the druid, in a sense, at least in my understanding, works as a form of ambassador between the different worlds of the forest and those of civilization to sort of keep sure that the two of them don't just go ham at one another. He is the neutral party. He is the Switzerland between the two factions. And the ranger, well, there are many other foresters and huntsmen that he also would be considering friends, not to mention all the animals that he would be caring for and the fact that it's an ecosystem. And worse yet, if this is his preferred terrain, if this is his home, and it's a fire that hasn't been, run by him, or that's not something that was meant to be scheduled or within the season, I can see him being very upset about this, because it's more than just, the nature that's going to be upset to him. It's going to be friends lost. It's going to be homes destroyed.
I mean, I have to just, don't get me wrong. I mean, we all know what happened to Saruman, for his burning and cutting of the trees. But these are things I always find interesting. And I mean, these are good moral dilemmas for some of it. But, a lot of the stuff comes down to, okay, we're going to try to catch this on fire. Okay, you burn some of the underbrush. The fire dies out. It's like, okay, now you get to regrow.
I think the key difference is it's in the difference between whether burning will cause immense damage to the overall ecosystem and those within it, or, for example, mass logging, as we see in the rainforests, where rangers and druids would hate that sort of thing, or if it is something that is part of a natural cycle that will allow the forest to be reborn. In which case, I don't think they'd have too much of an issue, as long as it's not done too often, too destructively, too wantonly.
I remember reading a comic at one point where a forest was growing aggressively, very aggressively towards civilization, almost like a form of entity of its own. They would just grow and grow. So the humans they were forced to just having to cut it down and do massive burnings in order to keep it contained, because that growth was now a destructive force that was trying to upset the natural balance.
Yeah.
And then that then became a sort of thing of like, well, the druid would understand that you need to keep this in check, because it's gone from being a normal growth to almost a parasite that's then trying to further itself.
That's the balance issue.
I also think looking at how I want to put this is because I like looking at different systems. Not everything's just 5e, even though they've converted this to 5e. Is if you look at the Iron Kingdom's druids, they're not the neutral druids that you would see trying to maintain balance. The way they're looking at it is that they will wipe out cities just to make sure that they don't awaken a great evil, which is always funny, because they have no problems committing evil left and right. Oh, well, we'll take these children and sacrifice them. We'll burn this down. We'll bring great floods that will destroy huge sections. and they're more anti-civilization than they are pro. What do I want to say? Like pro-forest. But
That's a different take on the druid, though, isn't it? That's
yeah.
That's an extreme version of what we tend to assume is the druid.
Well, that's what we take to look at it now. But I'm saying we need, when we start looking at the character and class, I think that there's a lot more variation in there because the druid in 1E is pure neutral, which kind of makes them, oh well, how does this balance out? How does this not balance out? And some of it, just like the Paladin, is okay. Why are you all adventuring together? It's time to break apart. Why would you accept a thief? Why would you accept some of these others? And I think that's why when you talk about the same thing with the barbarian, oh, I'm not allowed to adventure for the first few levels with the magic user. Oh well, I think that while the flavor is great, I think sometimes the way that they've been implemented has been very bad from a gaming standpoint. I mean, the idea is great. They probably make better NPCs than they do PCs.
Yeah, some of those do. I mean, I agree with the barbarian, but I could imagine a game in a more sort of wilderness-based environment where the party is largely made up of rogues, fighters, barbarians. Would be fine.
Sorry to interrupt. Grumpy has put in a pun that is just killing me.
Yes.
Oh, that hurts.
Yes. Good Asterix the Gaul reference.
Oh yeah.
Yes. I read every single Asterix book in French while on a French exchange when I was 14.
No.
Because I didn't have a lot else to do during the day but hey, that was it helped me pass my French exams.
Well, and I agree with Squirrel Hermit. It depends on whether you're just doing the straight 3d6 or if you're doing the 3d6 6 times for each one, or 46 and move them around.
Yeah.
This is one of the reasons I actually like looking at DCC. I mean, you can complain about all the tables, but I do like the classes in there. Is that it really does feel that alignment also means a lot for your character as well.
It does, yes. Yeah, that's something I have noticed when I was playing in DK's game. And he's changed it from DCC now to an OD&D clone. But alignment and thus the way you played your character was very impactful in the mechanics of the character. But I will remind now that in first edition AD&D, 3d6 down the line was not the default method.
No.
It was, in fact, Gygax suggested you didn't use that method.
That's why I mentioned I like 3 myself, because I don't like a lot of low stats. I don't like a lot of super high stats. But
because you were a power gamer, weren't you?
Well, actually, as a power gamer, and to be fair on this, I had no problems rolling up 100 characters in 4d6 until I got what I wanted. It was like, okay.
Cheers, Ian.
So I'm not sure which one's better, because it takes a lot more effort to roll 3d6. So okay, we'll just take what you have, rather than like, all right, DM, here, you can watch me. Here, everyone else can make their characters. I'll just keep rolling. Like, nope, not that one. Nope, not that one.
I'm guilty of doing that to play games of Baldur's Gate, but not face-to-face games at a table.
I got a program to just sit and click and then save the highest amount and then continue to just click. So I would turn that on, go to sleep, wake up the following day, turn it off, whatever the highest number was, then that was my character. Quickly go through the rest, bam. Get this game started, save the game, go to work, come home. Let's start gaming.
We've just had 2 more people join the lobby. I can't even tell you who. Well, Graham must have joined it first because his name has appeared just before Elfbait, but they appeared to arrive at exactly the same moment. In strange unison. So I was going to say, hello, Graham. How are you doing?
I'm well, thanks, John. How are you?
I'm absolutely fine, thank you. And we have another regular in the form of Elfbait. How are you doing, Elfbait?
I'm doing all right.
So, have you both been paying attention to what we've been saying, or have you just jumped on? I know I saw you in chat a bit
pay
earlier.
attention to work, so I wasn't able to.
Oh, right. And have you only just logged on, Graham, or have you been?
Yeah, I've just jumped on, but I've seen your you started things off in Discord, so I've seen some of that.
Mm-hmm.
It was mostly a discussion between Omanel and Elfbait.
Right.
So I think I think given that Omanel and Elfbait have had that chat in Discord, do you want to continue it live here or...
Well, I think I've said my point. I think it's Elfbait needs to argue his.
Go on then. Off you go, Elfbait.
Okay, where were we?
Wherever you want to be.
So, I mean, honestly, I was more responding to a comment that Sax just made. That was it earlier. So,
Right.
Yeah, it was just more about how. So, Sax just had mentioned that, like in larger groups, character classes produced greater variety. If I read him right, and I'm like, it just seems to me that would actually illustrate the limitations of classes more glaringly than a non-classed system or something. So if you had a whole bunch of people and they're all making characters on the same limited number of classes, you're going to get more repeats.
So what I was coming at was that a class comes in with certain expectations. So if you're playing a fighter, there is the expectation that your character will be oriented towards, manual work, something physical, bulky, up in the front, willing to go out and crack some heads. There is this expectation that comes for you playing a class, and that has an impact to the kind of character you will then be role-playing out throughout the game. And in larger groups, that's where you suddenly start finding, almost samey characters, or characters within a party. And then what I then want to sort of go through in this is basically like, how can a class impact the character that you're playing? How can the character that you want to play be impacting the class that you've chosen to have him statted out? And then sort of go through that to discuss how you can have variety and how you can have things that are different. The big kickoff between Geeky and I was the discussion of fighters, and we were discussing how we perceive them to be and how we try to sort of make them different. And then that's sort of where I was sort of coming from. It's how a class impacts the character that you might end up playing.
And here it's apt that Graham has joined us, because one of the character types we did mention was the more elusive type of fighter that relies on agility and bow use. And in our AD&D game, Graham was the one who was playing Valamin, the elven fighter, and in probably 15 to 20 sessions, going up from levels 1 to 4, how many times has Valamin been caught in melee combat? I could probably count it on one hand. He's almost always there with his bow, avoiding melee and skirting around the edges, being very much a support fighter in terms of his combat role, supporting the more meathead type fighters who are up in the front rank.
That's right, and that's fair, and that's how I see the role, and that's how I see elves as well. Although there's probably 1,000 different ways to play an elf, and I've tried a couple of them. In your game, I happen to the elf has a dex bonus, and I've also done a similar sort of thing with a dex penalty. And the funny thing is, it didn't make all that much difference, because you're kind of using the bow a lot anyway. And as long as you're hitting things and your team members don't mind that much anyway.
Okay, can I ask a question of you? How large is your party?
There were 6.
Okay.
The makeup of the party for the most recent adventure was 3 fighters, a cleric, a mage, and who have I missed?
Is there no thief or?
No, the thief died. The thief died early on.
We had an elf that was very stealthy, and he did.
Oh yes,
he
oh
did
yeah,
a lot of this.
yeah, yes, we did have a fighter thief, but that was Oceanus, the sea elf that they rescued from Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh, and one of the players took him on as a character. So yes, we did have a thief.
So he's not wearing armor or much armor anyway, being a sea elf. So he adapted quite well to the scouting role and was happy to do it. But he could also be a support fighter as well. But when Saxis was describing a fighter, I thought it was quite interesting, even though we know that's what should happen with a fighter, and it's expected to some extent. It's quite interesting when a player's take on it may not be like that, and they may be very, very bullish for most of the fights, and then they'll try a completely different strategy for one particular fight. So that, in a way, that can make it more interesting.
I'm going to ask you. I'm going to ask John a question about this, because I know this applies a lot in the video game aspect, but I know that you generally keep the players relatively poor because they have to pay for training and everything. Does that mean that the party buys armor for the frontline fighters and the cleric, or how does that work as far as from an economic standpoint? Because that's what really starts separating out a lot of the different fighters. When you have only a certain amount of money, is it shared equally, or do they go over and go, okay, if you're in the front line, we're going to make sure you get plate armor, and the guy in the back can keep on his leather chain?
Certainly early on, during the first few levels, there were a number of instances of where they were pooling funds to get certain equipment for certain characters. Because they've played the series U1, U2, and U3, and then they played UK4. U3 in particular, the final enemy, has got a number of, I think, slightly overpowered magic items for the level, but they're required to make U3 a playable adventure. So once they got to level 4, which is around the U3 level, that's petered out, because they're pretty much all decked out in half decent armor by now. They've either found it, earned it, or they've got magic item or whatever. But certainly the first 2 adventures, U1 and U2, there was quite a bit of pooling of resources in order to ensure that the cleric, for example, had plate mail. And didn't you all pool together for Ozzy's character Gorox to get better armor as well right at the start, so that he could become a much?
I can't remember, John, exactly. Yeah, I'm not sure.
I'm just asking because I think that's important at the lower levels, and then I guess the higher levels, it would really depend on what magic items and how they're distributed.
Yes.
So you're going through that, and that's, I think, what's really going to separate a lot of your fighters and things like that. Now, if you're multi-class, it's going to be a little bit different when you're shooting thieves. I think the other part being with the thief is they're not really defined as much by their items, but because a thief can only try to roll once, you really do need a couple of them to have a good chance of success at lower levels. And then at higher levels, you can sort of tag off into just one.
Yes. And that's something we did mention earlier in the stream about how 2nd edition AD&D helped to define the thieves, and so the thieves could have distinctly different roles within the party, because rather than all go up at pretty much the same rate in terms of skill improvement, the player had the choice of spending the thieving percentage points that they gained through gaining a level on whichever area of thieving they wanted. So they could, for example, develop a specialist pickpocket or a specialist trapsmith. But that was 2nd edition rather than rather than first edition.
I remember doing that, and I liked a lot of that anyway. Which was so the only thing is that you didn't get the same high levels. I think you kept that at 95% or something.
Yeah. But 95% high enough anyway, especially if the DMs are applying various bonuses and penalties based on how the character's approaching things.
Yeah, I remember my 2E rogue thief, whatever you want to call them, specializing in the climbing and the sneaking.
Yeah.
And not really much of the thieving at all, because I wasn't really interested in playing a thief so much. I just wanted to have a sneaky, climby character. So
yeah, so you had a more physical thief there, by the sound of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree that helps a lot too. So I think that's the other part that comes into it. I know Forbidden Lands, you can have different types of because each of the classes in Forbidden Lands has 3 basic ways you can go when you start off. So you can go, one can be defensive, one can be offensive, one can be a protector. I know something similar in Cypher as well, depending on what you pick. You can really narrow down those niches, even if you're still having the same role. And even if you have the same skill set, if you only take a certain number of skills in there, it does differentiate that part splitting apart. I say skill, it's more of a ability, it's a better place.
Well, is it more like proficiencies, or is it?
It's more like
I don't know much about Forbidden Lands, to be honest.
Well, think of it more like feats in Forbidden Lands, and it's very similar with Cypher. In Cypher, you might get, they might give you a selection of 12, and you get to pick 3 or 4 from your like. It has 6 levels basically, but you basically pick from that set. You can go from someone that's really just going to sit there and take the damage to someone that's really going to be laying out the damage. So that's what's going on today. Oh, geez, you have another one? Wow.
Oh, here we go. Let's just block this this spam bot. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think Halakar, picking up on the thief point here, the change in the way thief skills went up. I liked that part of second edition. I thought it gave more personality. I mean, I don't think the thief class lacked personality anyway, because to me, it was one of the classes that most infused my creativity. I like the thief type class. I like the role playing options that it brings. But certainly, I think second edition really enhanced that. And I do think that of all the various, I know the much maligned kits books that the second edition came out with, I think the thief book is excellent.
I like the idea of the kit books. I think the problem is that they didn't know when to stop.
No, they didn't know quite.
That was part of it. Instead of being very tight and having things in there, I think it got kind of ridiculous. And me being a min-maxer was like, oh, let me go for this one, and let me go for. And actually, I liked some of the kits in, was it the Vikings, where they had the Runecasters and a few of the others. Yeah. I actually enjoyed those green books because it allowed you to focus more towards the historical aspect rather than just trying to go for
the Vikings had a really cool rule with the basically some sort of ancestral trait ability where you could be like troll-blooded or giant-blooded and stuff too. That was cool. And then, of course, some early glimpses into feats in the Celtic book where they had all the warrior feats that you could do, like salmon leap and shield rim and stuff like that.
Yeah, I haven't got the Celtics book. I've only got the Paladins book, the Charlemagne's Paladins.
Yeah, I think really they were going for a lot of splat books, because I think the better way to do it would have been to make the arms and equipment guide and the fighter book one book and cut down on the number of kits. And then like put the ranger and maybe the ranger and the thief in one book.
I know they did that for the Forgotten Realms, where they would say, like, here is the fighters and the thieves, here is the wizards and the priests, and all of the unique classes that they did for the Forgotten Realms. But that was a world specific because of Eddie Greenwood.
But second edition was also the first attempt, the first real toe into trying to make big business out of D&D.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so.
And they got their money's worth out of me. But...
Oh, yeah. Same here. I still have all my complete book of giant slugs, complete book of.
I liked some of the ideas. When I first saw the Spell Singer, there are some really cool ideas. I just think that it was,
It went too far.
well, and I think that's,
Well, and some of them were such a stretch, like the Amazon warrior fighter with the first time you ever engage in combat with a male character who's never met an Amazon before, that you'll be at +1 for the first round of combat. Woo! There's an edge case.
Well, I mean, I like the ones that they had in the dwarves. I like the ones they had in the elves. I liked, but I think that
I think the non-human books did a good job of really fleshing out the cultures of as they're supposed to be seen in D&D.
Yeah.
I think they did do a very good job for that aspect. It was one of those that they knew that they could sell these to the players. They gave as many as they could, and you can see it now in even the 5e. And it's getting very bloated. Instead of saying, this is the DMs, this is the players, and of course expecting the DM to get most of it, the idea is being like, well, we can sell more to players.
Yeah.
Because DMs don't buy a lot of books.
Well,
Nowadays, they don't buy a lot of books.
No.
I'm going to say, Halakar's point here about making a dwarven fighter thief who was an expert locksmith, that is a popular trope, and that is one that's grounded in the dwarven race of fiction, from fiction. And in Middle Earth, I suppose I should drink every time I mention Middle Earth or call it Cthulhu. But in Middle Earth, if you played a dwarven scout, then what you effectively got was a fighter thief, because dwarves were naturally so good at combat as their racial background. If you then added the scout skills on top of that, to the fact that dwarves started with some lock-picking and trap-finding skills, you got a character who was tough, lots of hit points, because dwarves got a lot of hit points, good armor proficiency, but it would have to be lightly armor. Well, no, even a dwarven scout you could wear mail armor quite easily. Okay, you wouldn't be particularly mobile, but you wouldn't be trying to be mobile as a dwarven scout. You'd get good weapon skills, and then you'd have some basic trap and lock skills, which then your scouting development would then add to that. As you went up through the levels, you'd have a very, very competent fighter thief throughout the adventuring career of that character. And that was naturally created by combining the race and the class in MERP.
Yeah. Well, I've noticed in the last couple of weeks, in the expert set and back me, a mid-level thief can be a very effective offensive fighter, as long as you don't, you understand that it's not the defense, it's the offensive capability. Two-handed weapon, sneak attack can be very, very handy in a group fight.
A lot of that does depend on how the DM approaches the capability of the backstab and what can trigger a backstab, because that was left quite open. And I'm quite generous as a DM in terms of giving backstab opportunities. But I know of some DMs who would specify that you have to have surprise in order to do it. Whereas I will quite happily allow it for positioning. If a player says to me, I'd like to spend a round trying to maneuver in the heat of combat, trying to maneuver into a position and thus forfeit an attack on that round, I'll quite happily let them have a shot at a backstab, but knowing that it leaves them open to be attacked as a result.
Yeah, well, you're attacking from out of the line of sight. So I would put some restrictions on it, but not as much as restricting it to purely when the opponent is surprised.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of first edition players argue that you have to have surprise, you have to have that, and I'm just get out of line of sight, give up a round of attacking to get out of sight, but bear in mind that you've put yourself in melee combat, and if you then try and disengage from melee combat, you're likely to draw an attack. So that attack might be your one chance to do significant damage in this combat before you've got to get the hell out of there. But make the most of it.
You got to stab him in the knee. Let's just remember all the merc stuff. No, that's the,
So yeah, I wanted to go back to a comment that was made earlier about you have the bow fighter and the sword fighter and the two-handed fighter and all of that. I don't know if it was just my groups I grew up playing with or whatever, but I don't remember a lot of fighters really getting into specializing their role. They might specialize their proficiencies, but almost every fighting character carried some missile weapons and melee weapons. We didn't have a lot, unless there was some player in the party. I think we had one guy who wanted to be Robin Hood, and of course, bow fighter. But yeah, and even today, a lot of the people I play with are like, well, I'm going to have my crossbow on my back and my battle axe and my shield in my hands. And if we're seeing the bad guys far enough away, I'm going to pull my crossbow off my back. And
What I tended to find, though, certainly in my campaign where I got to fairly high levels, is that the player would, at almost every opportunity, try to use their most effective attack. So the more, and they would focus on it, and the more they went up through the levels, the more, for example, we had a big, strong female warrior who wielded a two-handed sword. I don't think that player ever used a missile weapon, despite carrying a bow. Because
my players were, and the people I played with when I was a player, always seemed very happy to try and pepper the enemy with missiles as much as they could before they would even go into battle. Like, they fought very tactically. It's like, okay, if we can avoid a wait-in fight, then we will.
That player just used to charge in, waving that two-handed sword, and try and cause as much damage as fast as possible.
I have seen that player, but the majority of the party's like, wait, don't.
Whoa.
And I think a lot of it, when you start, and I don't disagree with you on that, because all my characters had long range. It was like, well, what weapons are you carrying? I've got a spear, a sword, a shield, and a bow, and a knife. I mean, those were my standard weapons. It's like, well, why? Well, I can use the spear like this. I can use the sword like this. I can use the bow like this. And that's what it came down to. But that said at the end of the day, you still have to protect your magic user. You have to protect the one, and it's only whenever I think you get the larger groups can you start getting into the okay, well, especially when you're in a dungeon. When you're in a dungeon, you don't get long ranges. You get like one shot off, and that's what it comes out. And then it really depends that you might have the guy in the back too, and that's the other part that was coming into it. But
and that might be a big difference too, because we played a lot of wilderness games even before wilderness, the wilderness survival guides and all of that stuff came out. We just liked a lot of overland travel and going town to town, village to village, castle to castle. There were dungeon crawls, but that was actually our exception. So that may have informed our play style as well.
I agree with you on that. And you're right, they will play very samey from that. I'm thinking whenever you have to get into the, other aspects, or like we were talking about the low level, we couldn't afford the best, then players start separating. But after that, it depends on what magic items they're getting. Then you go, okay, if you're the bowman, you get the magic bow. If you're the frontline fighter, you get the plus, 2 shields and plate, and that's where it starts getting in there. And then once you get up at high levels, I really don't know what to tell you.
It certainly does happen that way. That I feel the fighters tend to go more, if anything, get more narrow as they go up through the levels. I mean, what Lord Fullmind says about fighters always had a main weapon, a missile weapon, and something for bludgeoning for skeletons. Once that fighter has got a two-handed sword +2, they're not too fussed about the fact that they do half damage against skeletons, because they're doing half damage of 1d10 +2 rather than 1d4 +1 from a small warhammer or something.
By the time you have a +2 two-handed sword, you're probably going to be taking on other things than skeletons. But your point does stand.
And the two-handed fighter is not going to. It's going to be very different than your long-sworded character with the shield. I mean, that's what's going to come down to. It's okay. The guy with the shield understands he's going to lose some of that, but then he gets a much lower armor class. So,
Yep.
so I think that's where that comes into it.
Yeah, I think that fighter got to level 8 with never got an AC better than 2.
Going over to your other point of that, the higher level the fighter goes, the more narrow they become. I mean, there is going to be a number of factors for that. One is primarily the fact that they're going to have to train, and training then means that they have to pick what weapon it is that they are going to be picking to be the focus as they're going to be going up. I'm going to assume that at least they pick a weapon that they will be focusing on.
If you use weapon specialization.
Yeah.
If you don't use weapon specialization, then I really do understand where that comes into it. Yeah, because then you start getting single weapon specialization, then double weapon specialization, and then that really starts happening, especially with the number of attacks. Because I think the bow had a different number of attacks, and there's double specialization than the other.
But the fighter would be getting more attacks per round as he would level up, just because he was a fighter. So that would be one thing to sort of like even it out as they got higher. But the fighter would then find that it would often be down to like, okay, well, at the higher levels, because of either the monsters had ridiculously high, hit points, or they would be very, tough, ACs that they'll be cracking on. They went from being an offensive frontliner that would be, charging ahead first to being the one holding the front lines to prevent anyone from getting over to the wizards or the clerics, as they will be laying down hell and fury upon the enemies.
Well, on paper the fighter maybe seemed to be quite narrow in mid levels, because it's really a question of where that player wants their fighting advantages to be. But a fighter could say recognize that their worthwhile job is for one of the fighters to protect the magic user, because they've noticed that at mid levels it's the magic that affects a lot of battles and a lot of circumstances. So it's a job that somebody has to do.
Absolutely. I mean, as a DM, I have no problem giving the fighters a little bit more advantages, a little bit more flexibility for what they want to do. Well, that's anywhere from if they want to try and tackle or try to do a quick pummel, shield bash, or the like, giving them options for different things to do in the middle of a combat to spice it up for them, just so that they aren't just a block that's put down to stop, prevent, or deny areas. Because for a player that might become very boring, so allowing them the option to at least fight creatively. Yeah, go on, John. You've been trying to say something.
I just want to go to just to derail slightly what Darth Beak says here. There's a simple answer to this, and that is to say no phones and apps at the table, please, and hand them your copy of the physical book.
No. You bring your own. No.
But no, I've got when I ran second edition, I picked up a spare copy of the player's handbook and I gave it to the players and said, "Here, use this."
I'm still the way that sexiest is just no. You can use your little PDF. That's okay. I don't mind.
Yeah.
On D&D Beyond, a DM could share his online literature with all his players. Obviously, that doesn't mean that he expects people to be reading all this information during the game. Yeah. If they want to prepare, then that's great, and know how their spells work. That's brilliant, but not during the game, because it's going to interrupt the flow. But you share this information in D&D Beyond anyway, without messing with the copyright situation.
The people making way more money than I do to try and figure this out at Wizards of the Coast / Hasbro say that players are buying a good chunk of the books.
Yeah,
that's why everything has player facing info in it.
Yeah, and that might be linked to the tendency for players to get more and more skills, feats, abilities, weapons, specialization.
Of course it is. Yeah, they're all carrots for the players to spend some money.
I'm going to bring up something a little bit different here. So, we're saying, you have to bring your own. Everything should be on your character sheet. I mean, I hate saying that. Your skills, the weapon damage, your stats, whatever your equipment is, should be on your character sheet. You shouldn't even have to need to open up a book if you have your character sheet in reality, and then the
Well,
DM face the rest.
how long would a character sheet need to be to have everything? If you're a medium level 5e character, I don't have a lot of experience in,
Well, even with
in that area,
like
but it
first
would be
edition spells too.
yeah.
Well, it's usually the spells that are the issue. But I would rather players, hopefully, if you were advancing slowly, you understand what all your spells do. And to be fair,
You should do.
and I'm going to bring it a little bit different. I don't mind having spell cards because that's easy enough for everyone to look at. And then you can, go ahead. Sorry.
That's not on your character sheet, though.
well, I mean,
I want to come back to Elle's comment here in a bit, but I just want to better check the new Forbes article on the Wizards of the Coast president. All phones at the table is what they want. It's not what I want, so I don't care what Wizards of the Coast want. My group have already pretty much agreed we will not be touching one D&D. It's not aimed at us, and if anything, I'll be dragging them back in time as much as I possibly can.
But we're 100% clear on why a president of a company would say something like that is because you can sell people to products to people via their
microtransactions.
It's not written for us. And that's the thing we have to accept. And we're going to die in 20 years, 30 years, and they need new players. They need a new player base.
That's fine. That's fine.
Okay.
Boneyards will live forever.
I'm going to bring something up because, for John, and I'll have to go look it up. While we were doing our stuff, and everyone says, why don't allow any electronic devices? No offense. I have my iPad. I have the little pencil on it. I can write my notes in there. I have my character sheet. It allows me to do everything I want. I don't like having paper because paper gets lost easily. I'm not going to lose my iPad unless someone steals it. But the reason I'm bringing this up is that while we were doing the Call of Cthulhu, and I had my character sheet up there electronically, I was also writing notes as we were going through the entire game. It's like, oh, well, what's about this? Oh, what about this? What's about
play
this?
online? Play online is different, but if we're playing at the table, I will always hand the players a paper character sheet. Insist they fill it out because it means it helps them understand the mechanics, and then I'll take the character sheet back in at the end of the session and I'll keep it.
So interestingly,
anyway,
I have a really young player in my current 5e game who insists on using a paper character sheet and real dice, even though we're all playing virtually on D&D Beyond, because that's how we have to play with most of my group being in Seattle. And he's like, and his rationale is he wants the actual experience.
Online is different.
Yeah, well, that's great.
Even online, I still like the tangible feel of dice. I do like the feel of.
However, for every one of him, there's like 5 or 6 others that don't care.
Right, we're going to go back to the comments. Does the type of damage really do anything other than reduce hit points? In D&D, pretty much no, not usually. Though I did add a mechanic to my 5th edition rules where certain bludgeoning weapons could deform armor. It hasn't really been used because my players don't really use bludgeoning weapons. But going back to Middle Earth, where there are a wide variety of results that you get from specific types of weapons. Slashing weapons will cause bleeds. Bludgeoning weapons will break armor and will break bones, which don't specifically reduce hit points. They have a bigger effect on character mobility. Puncturing weapons will hit organs, will take out eyes. So in that game there is very much a difference in how the damage types operate.
We should just bring out the Warhammer Fantasy critical charts and list out what each damage type will do to your character. Anywhere from chopping off fingers, losing an eye, having you stunned because of bludgeoning weapon. You might be wearing a helmet, but a mace to the face is going to leave you disorientated very easily. You're going to have penalties for your movement. You're going to be having, my favorite one from the Witcher tabletop game was someone pierced an opponent's stomach and got his blood poisoned because he got the different, like the stomach acid and other internal body fluids mixed into his bloodstream.
Lovely.
So that became an actual thing. That was great.
They've probably ripped a few of those from the MERP and Rollmaster critical tables, because there are options. One of them, for example, is something like strike to the head. If wearing head armor, opponent is stunned for 2 rounds. If not wearing head armor, skull is caved in, dead.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, let's see. So I've got the Warhammer up. So what edition do you want to go look at, Zach?
Go whichever one you want. I've got the second one that I've been told is the fun one. So that's the one I've purchased.
I mean, I'm looking at this now. To be fair on this, it generally just talks about critical effects depending on where you hit. I don't see it's for the damage type, but I do know that there are some others that do have that aspect. Like you cut off the. Actually, does anyone remember? Not that anyone necessarily plays with it. I think it was Dragon Magazine Anthology 5, and it had the critical hit table.
I can go and get it. I've got it printed out upstairs if you want.
I didn't like critical hits in D&D. I still don't. I don't like critical hits and fumbles in D&D. The game isn't designed for it, in my opinion. But
I liked it because what it did was that it separated. It wasn't an automatic; it was a percentage base, depending on how well you roll, which is part of the reason I like that. So if you rolled a 20, it was not a critical hit. It was if you needed a 10 and you rolled a 20, it was a 10% chance for critical, and then you roll on top of that. And I thought that some of them were really cool. And you had the same thing with the fumble. It just you had to have players that were willing to roll a D100 along with their D20 for every attack if you wanted things to move up quickly.
Halakar mentions one of the most devilish encounters ever devised. I trust you've all played White Plume Mountain.
I have never even seen it, to be honest.
Then I'll skip on because I'll need to run it for you sometime.
Yeah, I've yet to experience that as well, so that's one to look forward to.
Not played it, but I've read it. So
the types of weapon damage. That's the only time I can think in D&D whether it's a slightly more important is where a monster will have a weakness to certain types of damage.
I believe that in first edition, that's where it was introduced, where you would have damage type and weapon type, and the damage it would do against armor. I know in second edition that was greatly expanded upon, where you would have piercing would be good against certain armor types, slashing would be good against certain armor types, and so on and so on. You would then see an increase and decrease in damage, and how would have further effect. That was to simulate not only the war simulation and what have you. What I found is that whenever that was tabled in any of the few groups where I actually proposed it, people would look at me like I was insane, threaten me with duct tape and the ceiling, and it would never be brought up again.
Yeah.
It's just not worth it.
It's a way to really slow your game down, that and weapon speeds. So
See, I can deal with weapon speed, that's fine, but it didn't add anything. So I don't see the point in trying to do it.
I was trying to look for it. I don't see the PDF for the Dragon Magazine Anthology 5, but I did like that one, but it's not like it is in 5e now. Where, if you just roll this, you have to. So if you didn't hit, you weren't going to get it. There was none of this other stuff, but I did enjoy reading it because, if you're looking at it, if you needed 20 to hit, you had a 1% chance, and then on top of that, you still had to get like in the 60s or above, and a lot of times it was just double damage or 1.5 damage or +1 damage. It wasn't what I thought was overpowered, but it could be, and I did enjoy that.
Mhm.
And it did have it for different weapons too. That's why I was kind of.
So one thing, going back to the whole topic of character classes and affecting characters, something I have noticed is quite how, I mean, I think it's proved what myself and Saksha said right at the very start, how the fighter is the one that has the most sort of potential for flavor and different personalities and different types of character, because we are focusing now on combat. And that is the fighter's forte. And we talked for a good probably 40 minutes at the start of the video about different ways of playing fighters and and we've pretty much skimmed over most of the other classes really, really quickly.
Well,
But this, go on.
Well, I mean, the thief is going to be pretty much identical, unfortunately, in 1E. Like you said, with 2E, it's not going to be a little bit different. But when you get into the spellcasters, they really do separate themselves by the spells that they choose to memorize.
Mm-hmm.
If they know exactly the same skills, it's not going to be the same thing. Oh, and I did finally find it. Dragon Magazine number 39, July 1980. It specifically says edged weapons. And for the first 62, it's either double or triple damage. But they had edge, blunt, missile and thrusting, and then they have some critical fits tables against first damage. Anyway, that's enough of that. But you know, for a magic user, okay, I can be the utility user this time. The same thing with the cleric. He doesn't have to be everyone talks about being the heal bot. Well, you don't need the heal bot if you're the only cleric and they need the healing desperately. But if there are two of you, I don't need everyone to have the healing. It's awfully nice to get that bless or some of those other things that allow you to hit like magical items, or sometimes it's just nice to have a flame strike when your magic users out of fireball.
Yeah, I always remember the cleric being not so much the heal bot. That's what weird. It's weird that people talk about that, and I don't know. I wonder if that's like a later edition thing, because when we were playing, clerics were very seldom doing healing in the middle of a fight. The cleric was in there with his heavy armor and his heavy weapon, waiting in with the fighters, and then after the fight, healing people, and occasionally like pulling somebody out of the fight to heal them. I mean, if you had Quickie in the middle of the fight healing, that usually came from a Paladin if you had one. Because you could just lay on hands.
well, the other problem is that the cleric generally had the shield and heavy armor as well. So they had an armor class nearly identical as the fighters.
Well, yeah, because they were the other fighter in the party in the original classes.
Well, exactly. But they're meant to be front lines, which meant that you could get hit and it could disrupt your spell. So you weren't casting spells a lot of times unless you were the alternate, what I want to call, differentiating yourself. Either you're the frontline cleric or you're the backline cleric. The backline cleric was the one that had all of the utility spells because they need to cast it, or the combat spells because they would cast that in the middle of combat.
Yeah, I remember clerics, if they were going to cast spells, it was usually, I'm going to cast the spell before we engage in the fight.
Yeah,
and then
that's how I played. And if you've got one healing spell a day, you're going to be casting before combat or after, or if somebody's half dead, you may try and do something in the middle of a fight, but you lose your attack.
And when you get up to higher levels, you're going to be like doing spells that affect your attacks or your defense and stuff.
Knowing what I know about the nature of the enemies they were up against, when Graham's group was playing in UK4 When a Star Falls, I would say one of the pivotal moments at the start of the adventure was when a cleric tactically dropped a silence 15-foot radius in a room that contained 2 Darrow magic users. Now, I think when he dropped that spell, I'm not sure he was fully aware what was in that room, but the magic user in the party cast a web spell on the doorway, trapping the Darrow magic users in the room, and then they were utterly neutralized by the fact that then a silence 15-foot radius was dropped in the room where they were stuck, which completely took them out of combat. They could do absolutely nothing.
Yeah. And
that completely turned the fight in the party's favor. One simple second level spell, much more effective than a cure light wounds.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that made a big difference to the battle. I can't remember exactly, but I think we had some suspicion that there was a spellcaster in that room. We probably didn't realise there were two, and quite capable. But it worked a treat, and it made a big difference to the. It had as much a impact as a fighter or a bow user, and probably more.
They'd have been more than capable of flinging several magic missiles each at you.
Yeah.
Which, when you're third and fourth level, is quite painful when a magic user is capable of throwing multiple magic missiles at you. That'll take a fighter down straight away.
Yeah, especially if they choose to pick off the weaker members, which they may well do.
Yeah, because they're intelligent.
Yeah.
Yeah, my party in 5th edition on Monday, they ran into a enemy cleric who was really messing up their day by casting like silence and blind and stuff like
that. I mean, those are the things that to me are great about it. Is just like if you want to talk about it, is okay. Even if you don't have to do it in between, is I will cast a darkness spell in between me and the the enemy force. Well, are they going to notice that it's dark over there? That's just a dark hallway, and not notice there's some magical spell while they pass by.
It's also wonderful to watch the players kind of crests fall a little bit when they get the enemy cleric knocked down to like half hit points. Then he casts Vampiric Touch. So.
Right, Halakar has a question for anyone here who has played an illusionist. I haven't, and no matter how much I try, I've never got a player to focus on playing an illusionist. I've been in a party where there's been an illusionist, and what he says here is it makes a good point in that there's very few sources of inspiration for illusionists. It's one of the most creative classes feasibly.
What about the movie The Illusionist?
Well,
I've never seen it.
So, fantasy movie wise, I think the various interpretations of Merlin in various TV and movie tropes would be a good case for an illusionist, because a lot of times he's making people look different or obscuring things. Like in Excalibur, he creates fog and changes Arthur's appearance or Uther's appearance, and all of that. So
I'm going to bring this up for Halakar. Is if you've ever read the comic book Warlord, Travis Morgan's daughter was an illusionist.
Is that the cat?
No, that's not the cat.
I can't remember. I haven't read the comic since I was a kid, but
no, there's one part where the Atlanteans are attacking her fortress, and she uses the illusion. And they run away because they think that it's a giant dragon, and it's not.
Yeah.
So that's the one that I can really think of. And she's probably the best example. Gentlemen said love Warlord. I really wish they would just bring a good anthology of all the Warlords I could do for children.
Honestly, one of the best sources I can think of is old 80s fantasy cartoons. The wizards in there and stuff. Like if you go to like Thundar or even He-Man or She-Ra or Black Star and stuff like that. Almost all the wizards were throwing up fake walls of fire and appearance changing or phantasmal creatures in the air. But a lot of it comes.
Sadly, I missed out on almost all of those because I never got home from school until 10:05.
They were on Saturdays here. So,
I'm trying to think of
except for He-Man.
Well, Thundar was in the morning. Yeah, He-Man was every day, but Thundar was during every Saturday morning for us. But the other part is, but I think that sometimes you're gonna have to go through the comic book aspect for it. But I really did love that. The other thing is I've noticed is. And that's a D&D level wizard or a D&D level illusionist. A lot of times they're really low level, like second or third level, players. They're just like, oh, I create a little wall, I do a little bit of this. It's not the same effect. And I think that's, the difference between high fantasy and low fantasy. Sometimes I like the gonzo fantasy.
Saxius has got to go. I just before you go, Saxius, your opinion on illusionists?
I love illusionists. They are so much fun. I've played a gnome illusionist in a game. I didn't get to cast too many spells, but I have seen an illusionist in another game that I ran as a DM, who made clever use of phantasmal force. He checked that what the weather was. I told him it was lightly foggy, and he used that as an excuse to make the existing fog thicker, while explaining to all the players that the fog that was around them was fake, and that they had to disbelieve it, so that they could ambush an entire training camp of hobgoblins while having the hobgoblins be blind.
Well done, illusionist. Well done, that player.
That was a very clever use of that, and all he did was just sit in a bush, concentrate. Everyone else was running around while the hobgoblins were doing, night signals and calls and like trying to gather together, while the players could see clear as day exactly where they were and was just running around doing exactly what they wanted. So I think they're a fantastic class, fantastic school. Give it to the creative player, because illusionism is all about creativity and being able to think of ways that will catch the enemy off guard.
Exactly.
A good way to, going back to Helicar's question, I think for a lot of illusionist stuff, if you can't find direct references to illusionary magic, just think of the stuff that other wizards do with magic and just imagine your character is doing that, but it's all fake. It's like, I'm going to use phantasmal force, I'm going to use minor illusion, I'm going to,
no one was going to know the difference if they've already seen the fireball. It's like, fireball is a fireball. Like, they will believe that's a fireball.
Of course, a low-level illusionist can cast phantasmal force and make out that he is a much more powerful mage than he actually is.
Yes.
Well,
All right, I'm not saying we should do it, but I did find a place where you can get all the Warlord comics. So.
I'll see you all later.
Right,
Thank you, Saxius.
Warlord is one of my big heartbreaks. I've always loved Warlord. Could only get a scattering of issues when I was a kid, and right the year I got a subscription to it, finally, like to have it delivered to my mailbox because I lived out in the country, they canceled the comic that year. I'm like, no.
I still remember saving up money just so I could get the Dragon magazine delivered, and I know we've talked about this before, but the old Dragon magazines had so much variety in them, and not just for D&D. And I my mother liked doing crosswords, so I let her do the crossword puzzle in the back, and then I would read the comics as well. I thought it was one of the better magazines, just period, out there. But
I think I found them great for adventure ideas, and there are some small modules in there, but I like them as well.
Well, they had like every year or so, and I'm not saying it was on the dot. It's just whenever it came in, they had some really cool adventure. Like, I want to call them board games, even though they were on that cheap cardboard in the center.
Yeah.
It was like the one I remember is what was it, the Graveyard of the Elephants or something like that. And they were tongue in cheek, and they were meant for fun, and they were humorous. And everyone else remembers the one where you get the Play-Doh monsters and you'd smash. So yeah, but I recommend, if anyone has the opportunity of reading Warlord, to do so, because if you're playing a high fantasy game, it has so many great ideas in there. It's basically Hollow World meets, the SR-71 pilot crashes into the Earth.
Winged helmet and a pistol.
Yeah. Well, and he really used his pistol because he didn't have enough bullets. So he kept it just in case. That's what I liked about it. And but they did very good stories for it. But those are the things that get me inspired to play a game. And I think that his daughter, when she comes about, is fantastic for an illusionist on how she does her stuff. So.
I'm just going to say now, L has activated speed up on the video to catch up, so we all need to now start speaking in very, very quickly in high-pitched voices. So so
the tone stays the same. So, John.
Well, no, he's right, because I have the same problem too. Is I'll go through and it'll be on live and suddenly stops, and I'm like, okay, then I have to set it back like 10 seconds, and I'm suddenly put back like 2 to 4 minutes. You're like, really, guys? Yeah, I hate that. I don't know what YouTube has done, but ever since they've done it, it's sometimes stopped.
It's the power of the interwebs.
It does it, but I can rewind it back 10 seconds to go along fine. But yeah, those are things that get into it.
I'm sure Warlord's been compiled by DC into trades.
You know what? It only had parts of it. I bought some of them, like 1 through 10. I know. I was just letting you know
what's really cool about DC and Marvel, though? If you get the guides to their universes, you can get entire campaign maps, because they'll always do maps of their realms. So, like the Savage World in Marvel, they have a map of it, and like all the tribes and stuff. You could literally lift any, like the Warlord world or the Savage world, or Savage Land, or any of those other mythical places that they have in the comics, and run them as a campaign and have your campaign map pre-made for you easy enough.
Now, I'm just thinking, now that Saxius has gone, I've just noticed it's an opportunity for everyone to just go wildly off topic and talk about what the hell they want.
Well, you're the host. That's your job.
Is it my no? I appoint Saxius in that role. Saxius is
your heavy is gone.
So I've got to crack the whip now. Okay, which character class should we dissect now?
Why don't we do one of the ones that people generally don't like?
The Thief Acrobat.
Let's do one of the ones that people don't like.
Well, no. I know John hates the Thief Acrobat.
I played a really fun Thief Acrobat, so I can't say I hate the Thief Acrobat.
Elle says the assassin. We haven't mentioned. I've only briefly mentioned assassins, and the fact that their character was defined in first edition by the fact that they had to be evil, at least to begin with. So that choosing that class meant you had certain personality constraints to begin with. You had
it's
to
kind of
have
like the reverse of the Paladin. The Paladin is very constrained by his class as well.
But I like the assassin class. I wish my players would make more use of it, because for me it's an opportunity as a DM to add in these extra little sort of side hooks and ulterior motives for characters. I've always wanted to play an assassin, but never had the opportunity.
Here's the problem I have with an assassin. When you actually read the rules, it seems like it's more of an NPC character, and they left it in there. It's it says, it's a certain percentage to kill this high level character, then you're supposed to get a certain amount of experience for it. And I felt that way about a lot of them, to be honest. I felt that the monk should have been that way. The druid should have felt that way. Now, of course, we were talking about playing the rules wrong. When you look at the constitution aspect, there's that aspect too. But everyone seemed to love the monk until they had to play him, and trying to get them up those levels, because they kind of just fell down.
The monk was one I always had a hard time with, because I just my young mind couldn't reconcile why this very Asian themed character was in my medieval fantasy peanut butter. But
it's I'm going to make David Carradine.
I know why, but
I'm going to make a confession now that I was into my late teens when I realized that the monk was Asian themed, because I still see the word monk, and I associate it with the guys in robes who live in remote monasteries and do a lot of praying.
You must have missed most of the 80s for us.
Yeah, considering 80s in America was if you were a boy in America, every guy you knew had like a stack of kung fu magazines, right? And,
I had none of that. I had none of that.
And his mall purchased throwing stars.
I had none of that at all.
It was the Shaolin monk. Everything's like, oh wow, which is why I think that the Oriental Adventures was so overpowered compared to the core D&D. When you start looking at the players, but yeah, it was like, oh, a monk, that's a Shaolin monk.
Yeah, I think having having a very hit TV show too in the form of Kung Fu made all of us
I never watched it. Never saw
made
it.
all of us Americans know exactly what a monk was when we read the descriptions.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's David Carradine's character.
But of course, in England, we have something known as what is it? History.
I mean, actual monasteries where a monk used to live in the old days, and
that were torn down by the Vikings in 900 AD or whatever.
What's funny is living in the Pacific Northwest. I actually had Buddhist temples and stuff around me. So
yeah.
Well, I mean, I actually stopped at one in June over in the Northwest. I forgot where it was.
What's really weird is they're in the most unsuspecting places in the Pacific Northwest, because there's a little residential, kind of upscale residential area where you're just driving through the windy roads, and then suddenly temple. Not like in a very specific place. It's like they bought an old piece of property and just built a temple there.
Hold on one moment.
English history stopped at after World War One. No, the whole thing was. Speaking of which, we were driving and we saw that it said 1,000 Buddhas. So we stopped there, and they had the prayer wheel and everything else, and they had the with the wind blowing, with the mountains in the background in Montana. But no, I think that's part of the aspect of it is the monk was one of those that everyone thought was so cool if you could get up to 17th level, but to actually get him past 6th or 7th.
Getting past first level was hard.
Well, no. Remember, you got to add Constitution twice per hit die. So
you had an armor class of 10, and you couldn't wear armor. You didn't get a dexterity bonus, and
I will say, John, I did work really hard for the longest time to try and create a medieval reskin of the D&D monk. What are they? Kind of sort of like clerics that focus the power of God into their fists.
Well, that's what I thought they were. Because when I was about 13, 14, because I had no idea what.
I don't remember Friar Tuck doing any of this crap in the Robin Hood story.
Exactly. That Friar Tuck was a point of reference for me.
And Friar Tuck climbed the wall and then broke the bricks and did a cheese strike.
Anyway, but no, play.
I want to see that movie.
I've got one guy in one of my games who's been playing a monk pretty well, in that his character's goal is to create a dojo and take in. He's lawful good. He wants to rescue orphaned children and train them in his dojo. And I think that's a very nice way of taking the monk, a very constructive way of taking the monk, and it's invested him in the game world. So I quite like monks. I don't have an issue with making them. I know they're derived from Asian practices, but I do judo. It's a Japanese martial art, and I'm here in Britain.
Well, and that's the thing, we always managed to have some island off the coast of the homebrew campaign that was, a touch point for that culture. I did have a player who came up with the coolest monk background. He knew the player who always tried to mess with me as a DM, because he picked monk knowing I don't like monk, and he picked half orc knowing I don't like half orc. We're playing 3rd edition or 5th edition. I can't remember, 5th edition. I can't remember which one it was, his backstory, he came up with, his character is really cool. He was a foundling. He was dropped off at the doorstep of the monastery. He was forbidden to learn the arts, but the old master of the temple made sure that all of his chores were within eye shot of the training field, or did that Miyagi thing where they mirrored the art, and then he allowed him to sneak in and take the final test, and it was kind of cool. I'm like, hey, I like your character better than anybody else's, and you're playing the two things I hate.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to bring up one that everyone hates, and it doesn't matter which world it is. And I'd like to find. I have to look up where the Dragon Magazine has it, but I got to bring up the politician bureaucrat is the most hated player, or I think it's NPC class ever.
The politician bureaucrat.
No. They were two separate classes. One was a bureaucrat. One was the politician. They had
What game was this?
This was 1E.
It was a Dragon Magazine NPC class.
Yeah.
Dragon Magazine published NPC only classes for long, like the Anti-Paladin.
well, there was the anti-paladin, there was the duelist, there was the sentinel. There were several. They used to have all these in there.
They later on became kits, and then later on became subclasses.
Yeah. If you're adventuring with a bureaucrat, how does that work? You have to form an orderly queue, or take your turn in combat, or
it had the ability to cause like feeble mind.
That had to have been published in an April issue.
No, it wasn't. That was the weird thing. I would have agreed with you but oddly enough, they had Cavalier in 72. Okay, and
we could overwhelm the enemy with a mountain of paperwork, maybe.
There was actually like rules.
This character class brought to you by Douglas Adams, but
they actually had that. I mean, we're all laughing about it, but it was in there. I'm trying to look for it. It's of course, but they had all these rules, and they're like the death I guess you grabbed the wrong one. It says Deathmaster NPC. Yeah, I mean they had a lot of these different ones that were in there, which is like, oh, okay. But I think that was one of those that when we're talking about there are too many classes, and you start putting a niche in there, it's like, why do you need a 10th level bureaucrat, as a character?
Well, the funny thing is like everybody wants to make that like a new thing, and like I've got enough Dragon magazines to say that none of this crap is new.
As I said, Dragon magazine. I never got it over here, so
I got it in here and there, but and still though we would seek out specific issues. Like I think I've mentioned previously, I love bows built for strength.
Mm-hmm. We did have I remember a class in a White Dwarf magazine called the Houri, which was essentially a prostitute.
Yeah, I remember actually seeing that issue.
I had that issue, and I created an NPC one because I thought it's funny when I was like 13 or 14.
Oh, okay, so this is Lehman's Tiny Hut on Dragon Magazine. It's June 1983, which is Dragon Magazine, I believe, 74. And they have bureaucrats and politicians. And they actually have titles like obstructionist, official, manager, supervisors. That was the bureaucrat.
And I strike the ogre mage with my +4 rubber stamp of cancellation.
Well, you have to read these. I mean, John should just, I might send you some of these links to these archives that you can find, but it's like lose and find paperwork. The innate ability shows up in all bureaucrats who handle documents to get anywhere near a filing system. In other words, all bureaucrats. Documents given to a bureaucrat for filing or safekeeping will be lost as soon as they're received. If the bureaucrat makes the necessary roll of percentile dice, the lost paperwork can be found again upon another successful percentile roll.
That has to have been something that wasn't even good enough to make the April Fool's issue, or before they started doing them.
I did something, I mean, completely not associated with that, but in a 5th edition game, I was playing a necromancer, and but he was there was a bit of projection of some of my personality in there. He was a bit of an awkward sod, and he wasn't socially the most adept, and he had a habit of talking over people. And so I asked the DM if I could create a cantrip, and my character was called Ferdinand. And I created a cantrip entitled Ferdinand's Frustrating Filibuster, which would remind me of something like a bureaucrat or a politician could do. And it was a spell which basically allowed him to project his voice and talk over people so they couldn't concentrate. And he just frustrate people. So and it was basically it granted disadvantage on any sort of social check made while he was casting it. And he had to get him to shut up in order to in order to do it. And it was I didn't use it very often, but it was a little cantrip that I used for a bit of fun.
Themed campaign. We all play bureaucrats.
Why does it sound like my real life? No.
Going back to character classes and stuff, I see someone mentioned barbarian. We've already covered barbarian a little earlier in the stream, so I'm not going to go back to that. We bounced off assassins pretty
Thief
quickly.
Acrobat.
And Thief Acrobat pretty quickly, and then got on to monks.
That's
talked
okay.
about
Hey,
Bard.
John, I sent you the link so you can go find it in your Discord if you want to look up politicians and bureaucrats. And you might just read it for fun.
Shadow, we've done druids as well. We had a good 20-minute rant on druids and their druids.
Man, I
and
missed
rangers.
druids.
Yeah, we had a good old rant about their attitude towards balance and nature and what constituted balance and looking after nature and whether they would allow burning of forests and things like that.
You know, 5th edition has an interesting take on that, actually. They have a fire-based druid who is like fire as the part of the circle of life, part of the cycle of forest life.
Mm.
And I know a lot of people are like, that doesn't make sense. I'm like, yeah, unless you live in a state that is all forest and you realize that forest fires are part of the natural flow of a forest. I mean,
that's the sort of thing we touched on.
Yeah, and we have trees here that won't even grow unless they actually are burnt up in a forest fire. Like,
that's the sort of thing we were talking about,
Yeah.
and how they would react to forest burning and what the druid would think about and what the ranger would think about. And a ranger would more likely to think about the potential loss of life in there, whereas a druid would be thinking about controlling the fire and how it would cause the forest to renew.
Yeah.
And it's those sort of differences in the class.
It's like 5th edition subclass of basically of how do you get a necromancer druid? They have the fungus druid.
For me, 5th edition is currently at a point where there's too many subclasses now.
Oh, I know. I just talking about various flavors of druid. I mean, in old school, that would just be whatever spells you decided to flavor your druid with, if you could. But actually, it's kind of fun, the fungus druid.
And in my opinion, the 1st edition approach is enough as far as that's concerned. I in terms of playing a spellcaster, I will create spellcaster characters with themes. And I like to pick spells according to a theme. My necromancer, for example, never wanted to destroy a potential corpse that he could use, so he refused to use fire spells.
Well,
that annoyed the party because he I'm not going to learn fireball. It'll destroy the corpse.
Well, the other aspect is the as if you look at the rules. As DM, you can limit the spells, but the other part that comes down to it, especially, for your intelligence, where you were limited by the number of spells you could learn.
Yeah.
They want to learn certain spells because, no, I'm wasting these spells in there. So you're like, oh, it's this spell. No, I'm not going to learn that spell, and and you could do research. So that also narrowed you down on where you were going with your characters as well.
I also like to, at least in my experience with the people I played with, DMs and D&D was never this intractable, inflexible set of rules. If you came to your DM and said, hey, I want to make a druid, but I want him to be like fiery, can I substitute a couple of my spells out? I know a lot of DMs who would just go and say, yeah, go ahead. That sounds like a great idea. Or hey, can I make a cleric, but he worships this god of war? Can he use a sword? Sure. Yeah.
Well, 2nd edition officially allowed all of
but
that.
I'm just saying, I think there's this weird perception, and I've mentioned it before, that especially in a lot of the modern dialogues that are very anti-OSR and stuff like that, and very anti-old school, is that there's this weird perception that nobody did anything actually cool in old versions of the game, that we were all just a bunch of librarians and lawyers sitting there thumping books and getting grumpy and angry because somebody tried to use their imagination. And they forget that the game would not still be here if we're all a bunch of dicks like that.
Well, quite. I think part of it comes down to is there's a lot of homebrew, but when we really had, and I know that
we had Dragon.
well, we had Dragon Magazine, and boy, you look at it, and I know that John never saw it, but and I may send him the link that has all this stuff. You start reading through it, and you start realizing they knew that it was kind of limited. And then if you read second edition, which is funny because no one ever seems to read the forwards. Once you start reading the forwards, you begin to understand where the game design comes from. And that was one of the big things is like the forward for, was it 2E? I can't remember the Player's Handbook of Dungeon Master Guide. It says, make this your own game. We're going to only follow the rules as written. Everyone acts like, oh, rules. No one really followed rules as written. They a lot of people pretend, but then they find out that they always did hacks and other stuff to it. But go ahead.
Oh no, I was to say one thing we touched on last time when we were talking, when we got into a little tangent about like the safety tools and stuff, is that a lot of this new wisdom is coming out of old school authors, old school writers. That's Monty Cook. And what everybody considers like the new cool for how to run adventures, the Hickman type style. He's just the guy who got famous for that. But he's also old school like everybody else. You like the Forgotten Realms? Some old dude with a big ass beard wrote that.
There's so much in there when you start looking at it. I think what the part of it comes down to is they're and to be fair, a lot of it's clickbaity. So we see stuff in Twitter and everything else, and yet I don't meet these players in real life.
Oh yeah,
that's what I think sometimes comes up. I would never let anyone do this, but like you were talking about safety tools. We all did it informally, like I think we said before. But the same thing with these different character classes, like you're talking about for Beck, and I'll mention Beck maybe because I think it's a better designed game. Even though we all switched over to Advanced because we thought Advanced was better because it gave us more options. And sometimes I think the more options, like with 5e, just created more bloat and really left the simplicity of the game where we can focus on playing more down to rules lawyering.
Anyway, I put this comment up because you were talking about homebrewing and stuff. Did any of you ever do this with them? I mean, I've got the second edition books at the end. Something I've never done is attempt to create a new character class. I read the rules, but I skipped over it because I'm quite happy with what's in there already and just adding a little bit of flavor. But did any of you ever try building?
I remember trying, but not having the fortitude to follow it all. I made a crap ton of kits because I homebrew my own world all the time. So I would always have kits for various cultures and stuff. Whole classes back then, I didn't see a huge need for it. There was. I think the one class that I did try to write up, and then realized that Dragon had already done it because while I had access to Dragon, I didn't have access to all of them, and there was no internet to tell me what dragons I didn't have. I tried writing up a barbarian variant, kind of like the assassin, where I made a berserker because I was enamored with the concept of a berserker. Yeah,
I can't help but think that they pretty much invalidated that section of the rule books by bringing out all those kit books anyway, which essentially introduced the types of options that you would have brought into the game.
The kits were so non-mechanical anyways. They were just basically write whatever you want with some semblance of rules. Yeah,
some of them were mechanical. I mean, one of my favorite kits is the thief, the bounty hunter variant of the thief. I think it added a new angle to the thief. And,
well, I guess what I mean is they didn't have a lot of actual hard design implemented in it. There's no attempt at balance, which wasn't really as big a thing back then anyways, but you'd have some kits that were just like so light compared to some other ones which completely redid the class.
Well, I'm going to bring this up. Did I ever do it? And the answer is yes. I sat down and I created my own character class so I could get basically a classless character because I was like, oh, I want this. So you could create your Conan style character that had the climbing, he had the thievery, he had the fighting, and then sometimes you might want to add a couple of spells. And you got up to somewhere between 8 to 10,000 XP to get from first to second level.
Yeah, and customizing characters. I mean, I think we probably all ran into the guy who's like, I want to make a dwarf who is raised by halflings or whatever, or I want to make a human who is raised by elves, and that's fine. Okay, cool. You can have elf languages instead of the normal languages. You're not going to get the attribute bonuses because you're physically still not an elf. but we just winged it. Like I had, and I for the longest time I had a D100 chart of gifts because I was really enamored. My thought process is, if you ever look at books and stories, characters always have, even if they start out humbled, there's something about them that's kind of preset in the plot, right? Something is there. And so I had this like D100 chart that every character got to roll on, and it could be anything from like a financial windfall, like you get an extra 100 gold pieces because your parents had stashed some away, or you had an ancestral sword, so you might actually start with like a +1 magic sword, or you might have troll blood that I borrowed from the Viking thing, or something like that. I had all this stuff that and that was me in late first, early second editions. We all did that, I think. Well, not all of us, but
Well,
a good number of us.
the character kits you could use, it wasn't even limited to necessarily that fighter. So technically, a thief could grab a fighter kit. He just wasn't going to be as. I didn't start reading it, but I thought, in retrospect for this whole thing, and this is why I said this, I like Wolves Light systems. I don't have to memorize everything, and it's not as big of a deal for a player as a DM trying to remember what everyone's doing and what they have. Especially at higher levels, it gets overwhelming, and then you go, "Well, I created this really interesting encounter, and you blew through it." And the old saying of the DM is a player too. They have to enjoy creating these things. If they're not enjoying it, then your campaign is doomed.
Exactly. Graham, you're about to dive in, I think.
I was wondering, has anyone, kind of to do with the previous question, has anyone come up with a character class that does not overlap, the existing ones, or are we just talking about custom classes, kind of tweaking what we have to give different flavors? Because I was thinking earlier, are 5 basic, if you mix character and class, is 5 enough for a bare minimum, or would that not cover most of the possibilities?
I think so, but then I don't tend to judge my classes so much on the mechanics as the flavor that they inspire me to put in. And pretty much with the core classes that are given, you can have almost any combination of them, because of course you have multi-classing with those core ones. And that was always part of first edition, second edition. Those various combinations, you can make pretty much whatever you want and have the flavor you want and have some degree of mechanics to back them up. You might not have everything, but you have some degree of mechanics to back them up. And I'd be quite happy. We've already said, how much have we spent of this stream talking about just how flexible and how different fighters can be?
Yeah, I think it's easy to say that people played plenty of Cavalier-like characters before the Cavalier was around by just using fighters and saying that my background is I'm of noble birth, and here's my
I'm a knight.
Story.
I'm a knight.
I'm a knight.
Yeah.
And then they would just role play that social standing and stuff like that. And people played assassins, I'm sure, before there was assassins, because they just played a thief and said, "Hey, what happens if I sneak up behind him and kill him real good?"
Yeah, you're a bounty hunter if you hear in the tavern that there's a reward up for an individual, and then you decide to go and look for them.
Yeah, I think that this comes down to character design, and I'm going to ask you, Graham, you said 5 characters. What are the 5 basic classes you look at? Just ask so we can get a basis for that.
Yeah, I think most of the character classes that existed in AD&D, this is not high wisdom or anything by any chance, but it's pretty clear that all of those initial variations were the original group finding some little niche that they thought they could polish one of those existing classes into a little bit more. Like, it didn't play quite right. I fully believe that the Cavalier was somebody who's like, I want to play a really cool character like a Paladin, but I don't care about magic. Yeah,
very possibly. Or I want something close to the Arthurian ideals.
Maybe somebody was running an Arthurian campaign and they just invented that for that.
Yeah.
I'm looking at it and I kind of go, and I know it's not exactly perfect, but when we started really cutting things down, which is why I do like the idea of subclasses, or prestige classes, like I would rather call them. But when you look at it, is you got a fighter. His main job is weapons. That's his. He's a physical. What I want to say, his main thing is physical.
Yes.
And then you've got a thief, which their main thing is dexterity. And then you've got a cleric, which their main thing is spiritual. And then you've got a wizard, and their main thing is intelligence. And I think that when you split that up, that works out pretty well. And then if you wanted to, and I'm not necessarily against, I really wish that they had allowed everyone to be multi-classed if they wanted, and just say, okay, if you want to be a...
We did.
Well, what's that?
We did.
Well, in some ways, I know that they had the dual class, but if they had just simply said, you want to be a paladin, then you're a fighter, then you're a fighter cleric. If you want to be, what is it? I'm not going to say necessarily like Conan because it doesn't quite work out as well, but if you want to be that fighter thief, sneaking around, getting into combat, then you get that aspect. But the ranger would still be a physical one. But that's the thing I've noticed. There's a lot of physical aspects, and then some of them are, that's the way I feel about it. It's really those four, what Beckme does, and as much as people talk about dwarves, okay, dwarf is still a fighter, but an elf was a fighter magic user, and they could wear armor. That's what made an elf special. But it took them forever to level, and I didn't play really high levels. I mean, I did. Let's be honest. That power gaming, you want to get as high a level as possible. But as I get older as a DM, I would rather play at the mid levels. And then once you're about 9th or 10th level, I'm like, you know what? We're going into domain play. You're not going to get any more experience for the most part. And we'll go back to the adventure aspect. But that's one of the reasons I like skill-based systems is players don't get these huge leaps in power. Like you would, there's a huge leap in power between 4th and 5th level. There's a huge leap between 1st and 2nd and 2nd and 3rd. You really notice these big leaps. And then once you hit about 18th level, then everyone's kind of capped out.
So at that kind of level, I'm wondering whether class makes a big difference or not much. I know a magic user at that sort of level is going to have a huge range of spells. But for the other classes, how much difference does it really make?
I think when you get past 9th level, with the exception of paladins and rangers, you really don't get that much. You don't get, same thing with a thief. You just get better at what you do, but you're not really getting that much more attention. And I think that's part of the problem with the game when you start looking at it, is it starts, and every game has this, I don't care what power curve you look at it, it begins to break down at a certain point, which is why sometimes I believe in level caps for everyone, and then say, whether it's 20th level, I've had my friends talk about that. Is okay, what can we do that's cool? And I know everyone wants to keep playing, but I still like the idea of advancement without necessarily huge leaps in power. And I think that's the problem where level-based systems really start to fall down. Is either you're putting a level cap, or you start seeing where the system really begins to break down as you get those higher points. Whereas, and I'll just use for Conan in this case, you're still limited to your stat can't be above 14, and your skill can't be above 5, and you do get some of the special abilities. But if you get that many experience points, that's not going to be the same.
I honestly think. Oh, go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say. I think that in a lot of cases where probably those original classes started to wear down is when people were examining their favorite characters from fiction. Omen brings up Conan. Yeah, you want to make Conan. He doesn't fit easily into D&D unless you multi-class the crap out of him. And then how long have you had to be playing him just to get the basics of Conan?
The arguments throughout the years of what is Gandalf. I remember the
Other than a
saying,
demigod.
I've seen all sorts of claims of what he is. What he is a character in a fantasy novel. He's not a D&D character.
Yeah, if you're running him in a campaign, he would be an NPC. I think the closest thing we've seen is an actual D&D character for Gandalf in a published campaign would be the Fizbin character out of Dragonlance.
Probably. I'm going to bring up another part and this is the problem that I have with D&D in certain cases, is And very rarely did your magic users cast giant spells. They tend to cast rituals, which took hours or days. To
Your old
cast.
sorcery types, yeah.
Well, I mean, Conan had some that weren't necessarily that way, but that's what a lot of them had. Is when you start reading a lot of it, is it's like, what is Merlin? Well, most of these characters, if you actually look at their spells that they would have access to, or maybe they're not even the high level third. They're not the fighting combat. It's like, oh, I get comprehend languages, for third level. They get those kind of spells, and then they sort of die off for some of these things. And I think that's the thing that I get on that is, what is Gandalf? Gandalf is maybe a 5th level wizard, and probably you don't get the same level of it because I don't remember him casting anything besides light. His power really came from knowledge and understanding what is there. And yes, he could fight when he kills off what is that goblin, but that was, and he did have that illusion to let them not realize that it was during the day.
I will say some of the earliest fights I ever ran into over character class versus fiction is because of Gandalf. Why can't my wizard use a sword? The most famous wizard in fantasy uses a freaking sword.
And that's just assuming that Gandalf was just a wizard, because of course he wasn't.
Well,
I am going to have to bring this stream to a close very shortly, because I'm this month I'm hitting the free StreamYard limit. I'm cutting it very fine, and I want to have a Fighting Fantasy stream on Friday and be able to stream next Wednesday as well. And if we go on much beyond 3 hours tonight, then I'm going to have to dip into my pockets and upgrade and get a subscription. So I am going to have to cut it short at the 3 hour, which we've just hit the 3 hour mark.
Sure.
As I always do, I want to say thank you to Omen Owl, Elfbait, and Graham, and earlier we had Sackness for contributing to the discussion. As always, it was a good, lively one. Everyone in chat, if you've got a channel you want me to shill, I'll quickly shill it for you. Shadow and Sun, you have a channel. Check out Shadow and Sun's channel. We've had Legion of Myth on earlier, very big channel. Who else? I know Connell popped in, said hello, but then disappeared again. I know he's got a channel. That's the Cigar DM. And of course, our good friend to the channel who's been in a lot, who's been with me almost from the start, Mage's Musings. I think he was one of my first subscribers to start chiming in on my comments. Mage's Musings has a channel that is growing. And one day I would like to get Mage's Musings in the chats at some point as well.
Only if it goes through the puppet.
Hell, we should, because I've had a game. I've had a game with Mage's Musings, a game of Call of Cthulhu, and he role played the balls off that game. So he's a good one to have in the game. So I'm always going to shill for Mage's Musings because he's supported me right from the very beginning. But I'll say, okay, not quite. It was this March, was it? So it was 7 months. But I was okay. But my channel only had 100 to 150 subscribers around that point that you discovered me, and getting involved. I think Mage's Musings is one of the people who's been most supportive in the chat. So I'm going to say thank you to everybody for getting involved as ever. Thank you to all the people who subscribe to the channel, those who comment, those who support it, and to General Nut, who is my first paid member. He's paying me £1 or $1 a month. Whoa! So in 6 months' time, I might have enough to buy another Fighting Fantasy book. Hurrah!
Enough of those though, and you can pay for more streaming access.
Exactly.
Hey, there is one YouTube channel that I want to mention that I found really useful if you like old school stuff and like Conan lore and things. Yep. It's called Grimdark Half Off. And the guy does deep dive lore into like the gods of Conan, magic in Conan, and it's kind of general purpose. He talks about like the computer game side of things, but he also talks about the books, the comics, the RPG angles. It's kind of just, here's a bunch of information to use as you want, but it's not just Conan. It's Lovecraft. It's the Lovecraft circle. Howard and Lovecraft, and everybody else who is writing in that stuff. So it's a cool channel.
I agree. It's a great channel for that if you like Conan.
I always make little notes of things for me to check at work when I'm bored. So yeah, that's another one. And there was something else I was going to say. Our Call of Cthulhu game on hopefully Omanal. You're free for that this Saturday.
Yeah.
Well, we should hopefully be concluding Forget Me Not on Saturday. And I've been running a MERP game. We just started it. General Nut's been playing in that. And that started off really, really nicely last weekend. So hopefully that, and there's room for players in that. And I do want something I was asked to do when my channel first started, became busier, was a live play stream. And I know some people don't like them. And I know some people say, oh, it's crap watching other people play. But I have been nagged to do it. And I have picked a time and date. But unfortunately, only one person has shown that they're available at that time and date. So it may or may not happen. I don't know. But I have posted in Discord a few questions to find out what people think about live plays and whatever, and why people haven't joined, haven't mentioned it at all. So I want to know if people are interested in joining in a live play, whether it's the fact that I've put a stipulation of you must have a camera, because obviously I can drop that if necessary, and a potential time and date that people would be happy to play, because I do want to get at least something in my channel. It won't be a regular thing, but just I've got a few Sundays off this month because my Sunday job is on a 5-week break due to the pub I work at being refurbed, which gives me 5 free Sundays. So I was hoping to use one of those to do this, but obviously if people can't make it, then fair enough. But if you do want to play in one of those, please suggest a time and date that you can. Majors meetings, I would like to do a recap of the Forget Me Nots if I can remember everything that's happened, but I'll certainly do a comparison of how both groups went at it, because it's been very, very different. This second group are nowhere near as direct, but are much more circumspect. So it's two very different approaches. And thanks, John. I'm glad you're enjoying it. That's the MERP game. But I have rambled enough. If you would like to join in the roleplay, please let me know in the Discord. Go into the Discord and just tell me what you think about the idea. If you want to join in, if there's a different time available or what you want to play, just as much feedback as possible, because I'd like to have something, at least, it might even just be 1 3 or 4 hour session. That's it. I'd like to have some of that on the channel just to see how I do things and maybe get a bit of feedback and get people to involved and maybe have chat involved, influencing the game. I mean, that might be an idea as well. Have chat come up with some suggestions. So once again, to everyone who's joined in tonight, to everyone who supports the channel, thank you all. Great. Another good chat. Elf Bay, Oman Al, Graham, thanks again for being here. Good night all.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Broadcast.
Thank you all.